Chapter 505. Bang! Rumble! The 23rd Prince's mansion had been transformed into a battlefield. The strength of materials that had been used to construct this mansion couldn't withstand the unceasing bombardments of the many semi-sage and legendary's great, complete realm experts either, and they had consequently broken down into small pieces. The neighboring areas had been destroyed and turned into a complete mess. In fact, the entire imperial capital would have been tossed about if everyone hadn't controlled themselves on purpose. Ha ha! The black-clothed old man who was in the faction of the 23rd Prince was panting unceasingly. Hardly any of his body part was in good condition. It was nearly visible that the sword energy had severed his body vertically and horizontally. An expert like him who was at the late stage of the Sage Realm didn't have any power to fight back while facing that dwarf tiger. He only differed from that dwarf tiger by one small step. However, he didn't have any power to fight back in front of that dwarf tiger who was at the peak level of the Sage Realm. In fact, it looked like a game between a cat and mouse, perhaps more along the lines of the way a cat plays with a mouse before it eats it. And even the 23rd Prince was in a bind. He hadn't faced the attacks of the dwarf tiger yet. However, there were many experts in the 4th Prince's faction. The paths of those sage experts had been blocked by the sage experts of the Northern Dipper organization. However, the semi-sage experts were still approaching to kill him, and he was being forced to retreat again and again. The 4th Prince was watching this show from not very far off, and it seemed as if he was having a lot of fun as he said, "Kill them for me. Kill all of them. Then go and take a look which great alchemy master has been invited by my 23rd brother." He didn't dare to neglect the great alchemy master. A great alchemy master might not be a sage expert. However, these great alchemy masters were a group of very ferocious people, and that's because they could refine countless medicinal pills. So many people could be benefited from their skill set, and this very fact was enough to distinguish them from others' experts. The great alchemy masters might hide their key importance, and they usually looked very ordinary. However, they might attract a group of high-handed great sage experts to crush someone if the said entity offended them. A boundless aura suddenly emerged out from the backyard of the prince's mansion at this time, and it continued to soar up in a gradual manner. Someone must be making a breakthrough. Everyone was left dumbstruck. They hadn't expected that someone would make a breakthrough at such a crucial time. Moreover, it was a sage realm tribulation. Many sage experts were present here. Even the 4th Prince himself was a sage expert. So they weren't unfamiliar with the sage realm tribulation. Therefore, they sensed it immediately. This breakthrough had appeared from the backyard. So this could mean that that great alchemy master was the one breaking through. A great alchemy master might not necessarily have to be a sage expert. However, his value would increase several folds if he were to be a great alchemy master of the sage realm. He would become even more precious. And that's because sage realm was the beginning of transcending the mortal world. A sage expert's lifespan would increase up to 2,000 years. So the result would be completely different. The 4th Prince had become even more excited at this realization. His strength would increase by leaps and bounds if he could obtain the help of a sage realm powerhouse who was also a great alchemy master. Moreover, it would also be a very big advantage for the Great Way Empire in the future. However, the 4th Prince wasn't the only one who was thinking about this. The other princes were also thinking about this. Many divine senses of the princes of third-party forces had become restless, and many people had started to wonder if they could get hold of that great alchemy master before the 4th Prince. No one believed that the 23rd Prince would be able to make a comeback from this. In fact, he had already died in the eyes of those people after the grand-scale attack of the 4th Prince and the arrival of that peak-level expert of the Sage Realm. The figures of thunder dragons could be seen flashing within the black clouds in the sky. The clouds then spread over the entire imperial capital in a flash. This had alarmed the entire imperial capital. There were many sage experts present in the imperial capital. However, it was still very rare for them to dare to cross a tribulation in the imperial capital. This vast and mighty heavenly power had forced the majority of ordinary people to kneel down. The sage realm was for the sages. The ordinary people simply weren't on the same level. Therefore, they were experiencing a formidable coercion. However, the matrix formation of the imperial capital got triggered by the heavenly tribulation and obstructed those coercions almost immediately. Otherwise, the entire city would have been brought to its knees. The heavenly coercion became increasingly heavy. Even the fourth prince and other sage experts had begun to feel a strong pressure as time passed. In fact, it had begun to impact their souls. They couldn't help but suspect. How could there be such a formidable coercion? One must know that these people had crossed the sage realm tribulation, and they had already become sage experts. So, how they could feel so much pressure because of a sage realm tribulation? However, they didn't think much into it. After all, they had never seen a great alchemy master crossing the sage realm tribulation. So, they couldn't possibly have any idea about this matter. Whoosh! A loud sound of thunder and lightning streaking across the horizon resounded. A 2-meter-tall lightning man appeared inside the clouds. He wasn't clearly visible. He was clad in the clothes of a warrior. He was holding an iron spear in his hand. A strong sage realm coercion was sweeping out from his body. Everyone was stunned at the sight of this. What the hell was going on here? Was this an abnormal, heavenly tribulation? Such words suddenly popped up in their minds. They had believed that this had merely existed in the fables. Or perhaps the abnormal heavenly tribulations had only appeared in front of the great geniuses or the heavens' pride experts of the meteor sect. However, it had appeared in front of them at this time. Could the heavenly tribulation of a great alchemy master be so special? Moreover, it wasn't some ordinary abnormal heavenly tribulation. It was the human form heavenly tribulation, and such a tribulation was considered the most terrifying among the various types of abnormal heavenly tribulations. Everyone suddenly began to tremble when they saw such a heavenly tribulation, and a chill ran down their spines. They might have died in one slap if their sage realm heavenly tribulation would have been this human form heavenly tribulation. They wouldn't have said it at the time of their breakthrough, and wouldn't even dare to say it now that they could prevail over this lightning man who was issuing that sage realm coercion. Moreover, the thing that had scared them even more was that this lightning man hadn't appeared alone. Many lightning soldiers had arrived behind him. In fact, they had lined up in rows and columns. Each of them was clad in the clothes of a soldier and was holding an iron spear in their hand. Their overwhelming and grandiose sage power had ripped the vast sky apart. The surrounding space had also begun to shake. Many cavalries made of lightning were also mixed in that army. The men shouted and the horses neighed. Afterwards, the hooves trampled the void and open cracks, and the sound of vibration proliferated in the surroundings like drum beats. Everyone had started to tremble with fear upon seeing such a terrifying army of several hundred people appearing in the sky. It seemed as if the heaven had sent its invincible troops to purge the disastrous evildoers of the world. There had been similar records in many fables. These lightning men weren't living beings. However, the murderous auras that had emitted from their bodies seemed more frightening than that of any living creature. What the hell is going on? Why do I feel like I have returned to the mythological age, the era of heaven's dominance on everything? Those lightning men look like hundreds of thousands of mythological heavenly soldiers who have arrived to suppress all the evildoers of the world. Yeah, such a sage realm army is enough to destroy a country. And this sage realm tribulation has come for just one person. Can the sage realm tribulation of a great alchemy master be so dreadful? My God, it's not surprising that the great alchemy masters are so rare. They are so ferocious. Everyone was in shock. It would have been an enormous disaster for them if these lightning men had appeared in their sage realm tribulations. Moreover, there were so many of them in this one. This heavenly tribulation was enough to scare a person to death. The sage realm army moved while everyone's tongues were wagging. The grandiose army then marched downwards with their thunderous footsteps. Their war cry shook the sky. Their murderous auras proliferated in all directions. The entire world began to boil and shake under these dreadful murderous auras. The experts who were present in vicinity of the 23rd Prince's mansion promptly retreated in a maddened state of mind. They didn't dare to approach the army. They would die very unjust deaths if they approached or provoked the heavenly tribulation, since they would ended up being misjudged as a helper of that person who was about to cross the heavenly tribulations. In fact, these experts would have to run for their lives, even if a small team of lightning soldiers branched out. The people of the entire city turned their gazes inside the mansion of the 23rd Prince. They wanted to see which man was crossing such a terrifying heavenly tribulation. However, they were surprised to see that a figure leapt up and burst into that sage realm army, even in the face of such a horrifying strength. Everyone was left dumbstruck when they saw such an overwhelming scene. From where had such ferocious man arrived, who was facing such a dreadful sage realm tribulation? He didn't avoid it. In fact, he had dared to dash inside. However, some people felt that it was quite normal. How could he face such a terrifying sage realm tribulation if he was an ordinary person? This scenario wouldn't have been possible to achieve for ordinary people. The more terrifying heavenly tribulation meant that the person would also be exceptionally terrifying. However, they couldn't see this man's appearance very clearly. They could only see the shadow of a slim person who had worn a white robe and a golden dragon mask. Bang! Boundless, imposing aura emerged out of Yi Zaiwen's body. It then transformed into a vacuum of the universe. He was standing in the center of the universe. The heavenly forces marched over and broke the void. Their boundless, imposing aura pounded down from the sky like a mountain range. Yi Shiwen had already burst into the divine army. He then suddenly shot a fist, and a seemingly endless amount of spirit energies got absorbed by his fist as a result. They then condensed into a huge star. It burst out blinding rays of light which ripped apart the vast sky. The dazzling rays of the light of the star made it difficult for everyone to open their eyes. Rumble! It seemed as if two incomparably dreadful forces had collided with each other. Numerous cracks had appeared in the void, and they had then proliferated in all directions like spider webs. A trace of chaos had started to leak out. The scene looked incomparably frightening. Crash! Two forces collided into each other, and incomparably dreadful energy waves swept out in all direction from the center of the collision. It formed violent astral winds which began to blow everywhere. In fact, a truth realm expert's bones would have gotten crushed into powder by this incredible shockwave if he hadn't used his protection. Several of those sage realm lightning soldiers had been ripped apart by this dreadful force. They had then transformed into mass of lightning energy. Then they were captured by a force and transferred into the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror issued flashes of a bloody light after it had absorbed this mass of energies. To be continued. Chapter 506. Sage Realm. Sage Realm. Yi Mo had sunken into deep sleep. He needed huge amounts of energy in order to recover. This had been an ordeal for Yi Shiwen as well. This enormous army of lightning soldiers was like a horrible heavenly punishment for other people. However, they were merely a huge amount of mobile energies for Yi Shiwen. This lightning energy acting as heaven's punishment was so dreadful in other people's opinion that they couldn't dare to absorb it. In fact, their bodies would explode if they tried. However, There was no such concern for Yi Shiwen, since he possessed the mighty gilded tyrant form. His tyrant body had already reached to the peak of the 6th layer. It was only one step away from reaching the 7th layer. The more he practiced this incredible tyrant body divine technique, the more he felt that it had become profound. It could reach to an extremely terrifying extent. He himself had mended the successive layers of this technique after the 1st layer. In fact, he was confident that his tyrant body technique was more tyrannical than the original version of the tyrant body technique. However, its foundation had been laid by the original version. He couldn't have deduced the successive layers of this power technique if he hadn't obtained the 1st layer. His mysterious space was amazing. He could deduce any power technique to its pinnacle as long as he had enough spirit energy. However, the basic requirement was that he must have a power technique to act as foundation. It was impossible to create a homemade power technique without the foundation. Yi Shiwen possessed many incredible magical techniques of secret origins. However, he had only created the observing person scripture by himself. He himself had created the entire technique on the basis of his own comprehension of the hidden star scripture. His mysterious space was indeed incredible. However, it couldn't do everything. It couldn't create a power technique out of thin air. Therefore, this showed that the tyrant body technique was an extremely tyrannical power technique in itself. He might come across another descendant of tyrant body one day, but there was no certainty. Yi Shiwen was also determined to take advantage of this heavenly tribulation for completing the transformation and pushing his tyrant body technique to the 7th layer. Moreover, he also wanted to use it to provide Yi Mo the amount of energy that he required. He had already deduced the 7th, 8th, and 9th layer of this technique. However, he hadn't deduced the final 10th layer yet. Yi Shiwen had a hunch that his physique would transform in its entirety if he managed to reach the 10th layer. In fact, he believed that he would transform into another being entirely. He would transform into another species. Then his descendants would inherently have the tyrant body since their births. They wouldn't have to practice to obtain the tyrant body. This would be a complete transformation of the shape of life. However, that would happen after a very long time. The 7th layer of the tyrant body technique would take Yi Shiwen's body strength to another level. In fact, he even suspected that the magical abilities might begin to appear in his body after he had practiced the further layers of this technique. Just like those devils and gods in the fables, the existing Tao principles had been founded by them. But where had they learned all these from? They had acquired these remarkable abilities naturally. They had possessed a myriad of magical powers since their births. These were the magical powers derived from innate skills. So, there would be no difference between him and those devils and gods once he had practiced the tyrant body to the pinnacle. Then, the magical abilities might appear on their own. However, that was something that would happen in the future. Yi Shiwen's first priority was to annihilate this heavenly tribulation. Other people believed that rushing into this divine army was akin to asking for death. However, it was a form of self-defense for Yi Shiwen. So what if he would have to face the joint attacks of several hundred sage experts? Perhaps he would be crushed to death even if he was formidable. However, forcing into that army was different. He could freely attack them in that case because he had his enemies in all directions. So it wouldn't matter if he were to attack randomly. However, those lightning men wouldn't be able to do so. Moreover, he may be surrounded by several sage realm lightning men, but it was still better than facing a barrage of attacks of hundreds of sage experts at once. Yi Shiwen hadn't even stridden over, and the world had started to vibrate. His stature was obviously thin. However, he had reversed the flow of the entire world's spirit energies like a god. A dreadful storm swept across and crushed the void as a result. Yi Shiwen moved and raised his hand. A dreadful, imposing aura broke out from his body. The golden divinities crawled over his entire body and fused together with his body. He wasn't afraid while facing such lightning soldiers. His universe also expanded crazily, and those lightning soldiers had been surrounded by it. He was the only true god in his universe. Roar! 3 lightning soldiers joined forces and thrust their iron spears. They drew in the lingering Tao principles. It was a terrible sight. These lightning soldiers might not have the strongest strength. However, they had been condensed by the heavenly law itself, so they could casually grasp the Tao principles and manipulate them at will to launch attacks. Yi Shiwen shot his fist. It transformed into a huge star which went forward to crush. He had also accommodated his Tao principle into it. A kind of invincible and tyrannical force swept across and proliferated in all directions. He didn't hold back while facing these lightning men. He didn't have any escape route either. He had realized the intensity of this breakthrough. He would have to climb over this ordeal, and that's because it would be a dead end for him if he couldn't climb over it. Rumble! This was a stunning blow. Yi Shiwen's fist had transformed into a huge star. It then collided with those iron spears. Dazzling rays of light emitted from the point of the collision. They then proliferated in all directions. It ripped apart the earth and violently spread in all directions. The space collapsed and terrifying cracks were opened wherever it went. And it eventually swept out far in the distance. Roar! Those 3 lightning soldiers were suddenly sent flying away within the endless rays of light by Yi Shiwen's attack. They fell down. They were roaring and weren't willing to back down. They weren't willing to give up their martial consciousness like real men. However, a huge golden hand suddenly stretched out before they could fly up. It then grabbed those 3 lightning soldiers and crushed their martial consciousness. And then the big hand clutched into their bodies. A part of their bodies' energy flowed inside the heavenly source mirror as a result, and some part of their body's energy flowed into Yi Shiwen's body. The lightning surged over his entire body for a moment. His golden divinities were also flowing over his entire body. Therefore, he appeared like a human-shaped magic weapon in this moment. In fact, he had started to issue an aura so dreadful that it had scared the people. The battle was still going on. The loud heaven-shaking sounds were proliferating in all directions. This had shaken the entire imperial capital. The waves of dreadful aura were sweeping across one after another and were distorting the space. The experts in the imperial capital wanted to sweep out their divine senses in order to see what was happening. However, the center of the battlefield had been surrounded by countless lightning men, so they couldn't see anything. The divine senses were unable to reach inside since they got cut off by the endless heavenly power. Someone may manage to sneak in their divine sense. However, they would get injured if their divine sense got discovered by the lightning soldiers, since these soldiers would crush the sneaking divine sense. The spectators trembled with fear every time the heavenly shaking sound resounded. They couldn't imagine what kind of battle was taking place there. However, one thing was certain, such a stunning battle that could scare a person to death. The divine army of 500 lightning soldiers was enough to wreak the entire imperial capital. Even a great sage expert would have been scared to death if he had faced such a dreadful army that didn't fear life or death. They would be in a very difficult situation even if one such lightning soldier had become their opponent. That dwarf tiger possessed the most outstanding internal strength amongst those present on the scene. However, even he had been left dumbstruck when he had seen such a terrifying scene. In fact, he had become numb. After all, what kind of an evil genius was present here? It wasn't that he had never seen an abnormal heavenly tribulation. He had been practicing since thousands of years. So, he must have seen some geniuses cross the abnormal heavenly tribulation. However, he had never seen such a terrifying heavenly tribulation. He could still feel the vast and mighty heavenly power even though he was hiding far away. It felt enormous and grandiose. It seemed as if this heavenly power would chop down anyone who didn't respect the heaven. He had never seen such a heavenly tribulation. Moreover, He couldn't even dare to imagine it. It may be possible for a genius to make a narrow escape after facing an abnormal, heavenly tribulation. However, he himself would die 100 out of 100 times if he were to come across such a heavenly tribulation. It was impossible for him to cross this dreadful, heavenly tribulation. Therefore, he believed that the man who was crossing this heavenly tribulation was more terrifying than this heavenly tribulation itself. In fact, he didn't even consider this man to be a man. He was some monster to that dwarf tiger's eyes. Time passed second by second. It wasn't clear how much time had passed. It seemed as if a century had passed in every breath. In fact, it seemed as if the world had gotten destroyed and taken a rebirth in every blink of the eye. Even Yi Shiwen didn't know how long he had been fighting with these lightning soldiers. None of these lightning soldiers was a match for him, since most of them only possessed the strength of the initial stage of the sage realm. However, he didn't dare to relax, since he clearly knew that he would die if he relaxed even for a bit. It was difficult to assess the extent by which these lightning soldiers would surpass an ordinary expert of same level by. They were ferocious and unafraid of life or death. Moreover, it was extremely difficult to kill them. They were made of energy in their entirety, so their bodies simply couldn't die. Only a man like Yi Shiwen could finish the fight within a short time, since he had been forcibly absorbing their energies. However, there were so many lightning soldiers that he had also begun to feel a bit exhausted. The waves of his intrepid aura proliferated in all directions. The tyrant body technique was operating at a maddening potential. A part of the absorbed lightning energies had been channeling into his body and had been tempering his body. It wasn't clear how much energy he had absorbed so far. However, it seemed as if the energy inside his body had reached the saturation point. It had reached a critical point. However, his tyrant body technique was still operating crazily. Bang! Yi Shiwen's strength rose to the peak. It then suddenly rushed to a whole new level. The tyrant body technique had finally reached the 7th layer. He suddenly felt that his entire body had been surrounded by a dreadful power. He then effortlessly shot his fist at this realization, and his fist now contained 10 times more power than before. This was the 7th layer's power. However, he wasn't done yet because he still hadn't made the breakthrough into the sage realm. Yi Shiwen's fighting strength had increased by 10 times after his tyrant body technique had made the breakthrough into the 7th layer. He had been defending himself from these lightning soldiers with care until now. However, he didn't need to do that anymore because they couldn't injure him now. Bang! 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 An endless number of lightning soldiers were crushed to death by the huge star wherever Yi Shiwen's fist went. This fight had been a bitter struggle at the start. However, it had become a child's play for Yi Shiwen after the tyrant body technique had made the breakthrough into the 7th layer. Those densely packed embodiments of heavenly punishments had been entirely crushed by Yi Shiwen and were then absorbed by him into his body in a short period of time after his physique's breakthrough. Bang! Yi Shiwen's golden energy soared into the sky. To be continued. Chapter 507. Of course, it was sage power. Yi Shiwen's body had begun to exude sage power. He had finally entered the sage realm. He could feel that a tremendous change was taking place inside his body. His cells and genes were being ripped apart. They were then being reassembled into fundamentally different atoms. This process was evolving him into a completely new kind of life form. It was an entirely different feeling from earlier. A kind of formidable power was seething inside his body now. It had made him so excited that he wanted to look up to the sky and roar. He had finally entered the sage realm. However, he could feel that he could blow away a peak-level expert of the sage realm if one were to arrive in front of him. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they saw this scene before their eyes. A group of terrifying divine soldiers that could wreak havoc in the entire Great Way State's imperial capital had died at his hands. This feeling was nothing less than watching someone shooting down a spacecraft using a bow and arrow. It was unbelievable and inconceivable. Even a great sage expert would have retreated and fled while facing the joint attacks of these many experts. However, those lightning experts had disappeared at the hand of this man. All of them had died at his hands. Some people had also noticed that Yi Shiwen had skillfully used the tactic of forcing his way into that army. He had cancelled out their numerical advantage by doing that. He had basically reversed the siege on them. Therefore, he only had to tackle 10 or so experts at a time, and he had gradually eroded them bit by bit from within their formation until he killed each one of those hundreds of experts. It was easy to put in words, but not very easy to believe. The spectators would have been annihilated on the spot if they had tried to confront 10 such experts of the sage rank. Yi Shiwen was genuinely abnormal. It wasn't surprising that he had been able to cross such a dreadful, abnormal, heavenly tribulation. This was extremely terrifying. Is this the typical sage realm tribulation for a great alchemy master? It's not surprising that there are so few great alchemy masters in this world. Yeah, that was extremely terrifying. I didn't expect that I will ever see such a spectacle. He has entered the sage realm, but just look at his horrifying aura. It doesn't resemble that of a person who has entered the sage realm. Even an expert who has entered the sage realm a long time ago won't possess such a terrifying aura. The complexions of the fourth prince and several other experts had turned green. They hadn't thought that they would see such a terrifying scene. The fourth prince previously hadn't cared even if that person were to be a sage-level great alchemy master. After all, that person would only have been an expert of the initial stage of the sage realm even if he had managed to enter the sage realm. And he didn't think too highly of an expert of the initial stage of the sage realm. Moreover, the great alchemy masters often weren't good at using their fighting strengths. So he would have forcibly invited him at the right time. However, there was no way could he question Yi Shiwen's fighting strength after he had watched this terrific scene. In fact, it seemed that Yi Shiwen could even beat 500 sage realm experts if he were good at using his fighting strength. This was simply amazing. A trace of killing intention flashed in the fourth prince's eyes as he shouted, "Kill him for me!" The fourth prince genuinely deserved to be called as a formidable and ambitious person of his generation. He had realized that it was impossible for him to recruit Yi Shiwen, and his killing intention had arisen immediately afterward. He wanted to kill Yi Shiwen now. He had given any importance to the 23rd prince before. However, he had become a huge threat for him after he had obtained Yi Shiwen's assistance. The fourth prince felt that this was his only opportunity because that man had crossed the sage realm tribulation barely a moment ago. Therefore, his sage body must be in the process of molding. So, it would be at its weakest as a result. Therefore, this was his only chance. Die. The dwarf tiger was the first one to react. He was carrying a huge sword. His killing intention had risen to the peak. In fact, his killing intention had been fixed on Yi Shiwen's body since a while. He was the most important consecrate expert in the fourth prince's faction. However, he felt an enormous threat after he had witnessed the fourth prince's eagerness to recruit Yi Shiwen, and his hostility towards Yi Shiwen hadn't changed from the beginning till now. What great alchemy master! Look how kill you! The scene of Yi Shiwen crossing the tribulation was very terrifying. However, the dwarf tiger wasn't scared. In fact, it was merely a joke to him. He was an outstanding peak-level expert of the sage realm. He would lose his face if he got scared by an expert of the initial stage of sage realm, even though this expert looked somewhat ferocious. The dreadful aura of a peak-level sage expert emerged out. His aura then soared into the sky, and it pounded upon Yi Shiwen as if a galaxy had fallen from the ninth heaven. The space got fractured by every movement he made. He hadn't revealed his terrifying fighting strength in its entirety when he was fighting with that black-clothed old man. However, he had now unleashed it. He had run away from so many enemies of his clan in the past, and he had been living properly so far. Hence, his strength had increased significantly. Moreover, he wasn't some weakling. He was a peak-level sage expert. Yi Shiwen had understood that the fourth prince wanted to launch a surprise attack on him since his sage body was still consolidating. He had realized that the fourth prince wanted to get rid of him. Yi Shiwen didn't escape with the thought of returning after his sage body had consolidated, and this was unlike what others had expected. Instead, he strode forward like a meteor. He took large strides and approached like a mountain. His vitality condensed into a pillar of energy and soared into the sky. He arrived in front of the dwarf tiger within a flash. However, he seemed indifferent towards his opponent. His outstanding aura clashed against that dwarf tiger's formidable aura. His might wasn't the least bit lacking. In fact, it was very strong on the contrary. Two incredible auras had suddenly collided in the sky. Endless cracks appeared in the void along with a shattering sound. Bang! Yi Shiwen raised his hand to attack. He brandished his fist, and it pounded like a star. It was a head-on collision. His fist fearlessly swept forward to face the long sword of that dwarf tiger. He unleashed the Big Bang Stardust Fist in front of everyone. Those lightning soldiers had obstructed the line of sights of these people a while ago. However, they could see everything very clearly at this time. So, they immediately felt that they had landed into the vast universe. Yi Shiwen was the only god in this universe. He was ruler of this endless void. Let me send you to hell, great master of alchemy, or whatever. I will send you to hell. The dwarf tiger suddenly roared loudly. His whole Bodis energy condensed in his long sword. It then transformed into a giant dragon and rushed forward. Whoosh! This strike shook the world. The deafening sound of the collision of metals resounded. Yi Zaiwen's fist and the dwarf tiger's long sword firmly collided with each other, and a huge crack proliferated in all directions from the point of collision. Bang! Those cracks collapsed with a loud bang, and this exposed the pitch-black, dreadful chaos. Everyone was left petrified at this spectacle. The long sword in the hand of the dwarf tiger didn't look extraordinary. However, it was a real sage sword. Furthermore, it was a sage tool with attack power at its forte. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid. He merely used his fist and rushed straight up. His body had become intrepid to what extent? Many people guessed that Yi Shiwen would be cut into two halves. However, some people also felt that he would have had confidence in himself if he had dared to use his fist to resist. Ah! A scream sounded from the collision. The dwarf tiger was sent flying back from the point of collision. He staggered and retreated several steps. He was forced to retreat in order to neutralize the very large force that his body had been subjected to. The void broke down with each step that he took. The cracks then spread out like giant spiderwebs. Everyone was surprised to find that the dwarf tiger's small body was covered with blood. It seemed as if his entire body had been fished out from the insides of a blood pit. Poof! Dwarf tiger spouted a mouthful of blood, then coughed out more blood. The muscles of his arms had cracked open since he had been holding the long sword with them. Moreover, blood was gushing out from them. His hands had started to collapse inch by inch since they had encountered a strike that carried unfathomably massive impact force. The look in his eyes seemed exceptionally fearsome. His arrogance had collapsed in the collision that had taken place. In fact, he couldn't believe what had happened a moment ago. He couldn't dare to imagine that a peak-level expert of the sage realm like himself had been defeated by an expert who had barely entered the sage realm a moment ago. He had been sent flying in one move. It had certainly subverted his common sense. How could someone be so powerful that they had defeated him using their strength of the initial stage of the sage realm? Everyone had been scared by the sight of this spectacle. This slim figure was extremely powerful. He had used one fist attack, nothing more. The dwarf tiger was regarded as the strongest among them. However, he had been defeated by this person very effortlessly. Everyone was thinking that the entire situation in this contest for the throne had reversed. People hadn't been optimistic about the 23rd prince. However, he had become enormously popular since Yi Shiwen had joined his faction. That fourth prince had been highly popular in the beginning. However, he would lose his popularity and become a trash if the dwarf tiger died. In fact, even his life might be put in danger. It's impossible. I can't accept this. The dwarf tiger roared loudly. The sound of the friction of his bones sounded from his body. His long sword rose even higher in the sky than it had before. He had even begun to grow at a slow pace. His imposing aura had become even more tyrannical than before. The wounds on his body had healed and had begun to form scabs. Moreover, his height had become almost equal to the height of an average man. Clang! Dwarf Tiger's long sword emitted ice-cold luster as it suddenly fell down. It carried boundless sword energy with it. It pounded upon Yi Shiwen, and it seemed as if a galaxy had fallen from the ninth heaven. Whoosh! Yi Shiwen raised his hand, and a massive fist fell down. It was surrounded by boundless star power. It was exceptionally dazzling. Bang! The portion between Dwarf Tiger's thumb and forefinger got ruptured. His hands had been numbed by Yi Shiwen in a split second. Yi Shiwen grabbed the edge of the sword with his bare hands. He had managed to hold that sage sword with his bare hands. He hadn't even worn any gloves for protection. This long sage sword emitted profound rays of light when this happened. It then struggled to escape from Yi Zaiwen's hand. However, golden rays of light suddenly burst out from his hands. They then crushed the sword spirit of that sage sword. Ah! The dwarf tiger again spouted a mouthful of blood. His complexion had turned deathly pale. However, Yi Shiwen didn't wait for him to react as he slashed the long sword like a lightning. The strike transformed into a cold sword light. This sword light then dropped down to chop the dwarf tiger. Poochie! The dwarf tiger's body was cut into two halves by the sword light and blood splashed out. His soul was also annihilated in that split second. That scene was enshrouded in a pin-drop silence as this happened. The sound of breeze resounded in the sky. However, it had a faintly bleak chilliness and mournfulness to it. A peak-level expert of the sage realm had died. In fact, he couldn't even resist 2 moves from Yi Shiwen. He had been slaughtered by Yi Shiwen after they had clashed head-on. To be continued. Chapter 508. This outcome was clearly beyond their imagination. The dwarf tiger had seemed incomparably powerful in the beginning, so nobody had expected that he would collapse at first blow. He was no match for Yi Shiwen. This scene had blown everyone away in a flash. Yi Shiwen was callously looking at everyone. The sage, level sword that was in his hand suddenly swept out. A loud sound reverberated in the sky, and countless sword energies burst out. Everyone was terrified at the sight of this. The buried person's sword had revealed more dreadful might than before. It was undeniable that the current Yi Shiwen didn't care whether the weapon in his hand was a sage tool or not. After all, he had dared to use an ordinary iron sword in a fight with an expert who possessed a sage tool. However, the might of his buried sword's secret would reach an extreme condition if he had a sage sword in his hand. This sage sword issued far more dreadful might in Yi Zaiwen's hand than it had issued in the hand of the dwarf tiger. The radiance of his brilliant swordsmanship nearly covered the entire imperial capital. Bang! 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 Those sword energies struck the subordinates of the fourth prince, one after another, since they happened to be in the way. They were then transformed into blood fog and scattered in the sky. This scene had left everyone speechless. They had understood why the fourth prince had wanted to attack when Yi Zaiwen's sage body was condensing, because that might be Yi Zaiwen's weakest moment. However, the outcome had been beyond their expectations. He had still killed that dwarf tiger and a group of experts effortlessly. The deceased had then transformed into blood fog, even though Yi Zaiwen's sage body was still taking shape. The fourth prince had looked quite calm at first. However, his complexion had turned exceptionally ugly when he saw this scene because Yi Shiwen was coming towards him at this time with that long sword in his hand. The sharp end of the sword streaked across the void and delimited a huge crack. This crack looked like the one on a neat paper. You. The fourth prince didn't get time to speak. He only saw a cold beam of light, and his body was then split open in the sky. He had been cut into two halves by Yi Shiwen. Even his soul had been annihilated. The outstanding heroes of the Great Wei State became silent as they watched this scene. Nobody had dared to step out and speak up for the fourth prince. One must pay a price in this contest for the title of emperor. There was no one who hadn't paid any price. One must face the decisive battle of life or death once they had stepped onto this road of the contest for the throne. And they wouldn't have any escape route because one would land into a deep abyss or a dead end if they'd withdraw even a single step. In other words, nobody would have spoken for 23rd Prince, either if he had died today. In short, nobody would have shed tears for him. This reality of this contest was too cruel. However, the 23rd Prince had become very popular with the death of the 4th Prince. He was considered a trash at the start. However, he had suddenly become the hot favorite in this contest for the throne after he had obtained the support of an incredibly powerful expert like Yi Shiwen. Some people were unequivocal about their stance of protesting against the injustice suffered by the 4th Prince. However, they didn't dare to say anything right now since Yi Shiwen had displayed extremely terrifying fighting strength. Could they kill a peak-level expert of the Sage Realm within such a short time if they had been in his place? Moreover, this wasn't the most crucial point. The most crucial point was that they had seen Yi Zaiwen's dreadful heavenly tribulation. A divine army of 500 sage experts had effortlessly lost at his hands. They hadn't been a match for him either. Only an expert at the small perfection level of the Sage Realm could stop him. It wasn't that the Imperial clan didn't have such experts. However, experts of such rank wouldn't participate in this contest for throne, since such experts often took a neutral stance. In fact, there was no need for such experts to participate in this contest. After all, they were at a level where it didn't matter to them who'd ascend to the throne of the imperial capital. Whoever acquired the throne would then try to rope them in, and they didn't wish to break their existing consecration. Therefore, there was no need for them to expose themselves to unusual danger and pull chestnuts out of the fire. After all, everything could be finished if they made a single mistake. Therefore, the people who often took part in the contest for the throne were the ones like the old ancestor Gongyang, since he wasn't too strong. Such people would put everything they had in the contest. Otherwise, they might not advance ahead in their entire lifetime. The so-called martial cultivation required the so-called basic required conditions, namely law, loyalty, wealth, and land. However, these experts were random cultivators with no backgrounds. So, the thing they lacked the most was resources, and only such contests might help them in acquiring resources that could help them towards cultivating to an even higher level in their lifetime. It seems that the 4th Prince wasn't the most secretive. This unknown 23rd Prince was. He had also said that he wanted to participate in the contest. However, I never expected that he has such profound background and had concealed such an expert as well, and that heavenly tribulation could easily scare a person to death. Perhaps the entire imperial capital might have been destroyed under his heavenly tribulation if he hadn't crossed it. I had noticed that the 23rd Prince had returned along with 2 consecrate experts, and then another group of people arrived. Moreover, all of them were dressed in similar clothes. So, they must belong to the same organization. He might have obtained the support of some organization, but it's quite difficult to say which one. Such battle strength is enough to sweep away the consecrate experts of the other princes. The entire imperial capital was talking about this matter. Some people were happy and excited because of the sudden rise of the 23rd prince. However, some people were worried as well. That was because the 23rd prince's participation had suddenly made this already confusing contest between the princes even more chaotic. Crap! What happened here? Rays of light flashed in the sky. The wood dragon came out of the void. He was carrying the big head of a person. The head fell down as he came out of the void. That was the head of that commander who was clad in the silver armor. He had obviously lost his life to Wood Dragon in that fight. The Wood Dragon had traveled more than several thousand miles while chasing this chief clad in that silver armor, and he had eventually killed this seriously injured chief. He had returned only a moment ago. However, he then found out that the atmosphere of the entire imperial capital wasn't very normal. It should be mentioned that the atmosphere had become very intense. Moreover, the residual aura of the heavenly tribulation was still lingering in the environment and hadn't scattered in its entirety. In fact, this dreadful aura could make a person's soul tremble. This aura was so dreadful that the Wood Dragon could feel that an incredible heavenly tribulation had occurred here, even though it had dispersed a long time ago. However, he didn't know what exactly had happened here. However, he then saw Yi Shiwen holding a sage sword in his hand. Moreover, Yi Zaiwen's body still possessed some residual tribulation aura. This clearly indicated that he had made the breakthrough into the sage realm. In fact, some of the tribulation aura hadn't dispersed because his restraint wasn't at its best right now. So, the Wood Dragon had suddenly sensed it. Fu ** Kami, it's not you who has crossed the heavenly tribulation a moment ago, right? The Wood Dragon stared at Yi Shiwen. He could see that Yi Zaiwen's strength had become far more powerful than before, and this had left him terrified. One must know that he had always intimidated other people with his strength and innate talent, and nobody had ever scared him. However, the residual aura of that heavenly tribulation on Yi Zaiwen's body had left him terrified. Of course, it was a feeling of heavenly power, a kind of revere that all living things have for the heaven. This was an instinctive reaction, so he had no control over it either. Yeah, Yi Shiwen nodded. He put his sage sword inside the heavenly source mirror and allowed Yi Mo to swallow it. Scarlet rays of light emitted inside the heavenly source mirror as a result, and his entire inner universe illuminated with a scarlet color. In fact, his universe appeared like a sea of blood now. These rays of light were more dazzling than the time when Yi Mo had swallowed the Blood Emperor seal. A pleasant smile appeared on Yi Zaiwen's face because he knew that the heavenly source mirror had recovered very significantly. It should be mentioned that it wasn't the heavenly source mirror that had recovered. Rather, it was Yi Mo who had recovered. In fact, the heavenly source mirror hadn't suffered much damage because it hadn't really fought against the Phoenix guy. It had only used the energy field to scare the enemy away. So, the one who had suffered damage was Yi Mo. In fact, the heavenly source mirror wouldn't have any issues and would become easy to use if Yi Shiwen were to make a harsh decision and erase Yi Mo. However, how could Yi Shiwen be willing to erase Yi Mo? Yi Mo had been like a teacher and friend to him for so many years. He had taught many things to him. Yi Shiwen might have died by now if he wasn't there. In fact, he would have died even before he had met that man of the ancient Phoenix world. In any case, he would never give up on Yi Mo, no matter what. Crap, what kind of a heavenly tribulation have you crossed? How it can be so terrifying? The Wood Dragon simply couldn't believe this. Everything had quickly transformed after the heavenly tribulation. Clouds had turned mild, and the wind had become gentle. Even those things that had been trampled down by the heavenly tribulation had begun to recover under the influence of abundant spirit energy. Therefore, it was obvious that a lot of time had passed since the event. However, he could still feel so much residual aura of the heavenly tribulation. So, he could well imagine what kind of a heavenly tribulation Yi Shiwen must have crossed. You're a monster. People say that I'm a monster and whatnot. However, I am nothing in comparison to you. The wood dragon spoke up in a depressing tone. There were several experts of the younger generation in the Northern Dipper organization, and he had been working with Ching Su since a long time. He simply didn't wish to compare himself with Ching Su. They weren't equal. Ching Su had arrived late, and he had arrived earlier. Moreover, he was almost 100 years older than Ching Su. They were the experts of same generation in many people's opinion. After all, a gap of 100 years for these experts was nothing since they used to practice for nearly endless time. However, he still felt unpleasant since Ching Su had caught up with him even though he had arrived after him, and he had gotten to see Yi Shiwen, and he felt that Yi Shiwen was the genuine monster. He became somewhat dejected as a result. You and Ching Su are freaks. I also have the reputation of Heaven's pride expert. However, am nothing in front of you. This isn't good. I will fall far behind you if it continues like this. I will also rush to the Enlightening Mind Mountain once this mission ends. And I won't come out of the mountain until I surpass you. The wood dragon muttered since the thought of those two monsters had stimulated him. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but laugh. But he didn't argue with him. Only he himself knew that he wasn't some genius. He didn't have outstanding innate talent, so he couldn't even dare to compare himself with these geniuses. In fact, he himself didn't know how many times he had made narrow escapes in order to reach this stage. To be continued. Chapter 509. Yi Shiwen merely laughed in response. He didn't argue with him. Only he himself knew that he wasn't a genius. He didn't possess outstanding innate talent. So, he obviously couldn't be compared with these geniuses. He himself didn't know how many times he had made narrow escapes from death in order to reach up to this stage. He had reached till this stage by fighting against the people, as well as the heaven. The news that Yi Shiwen had killed the dwarf tiger and the fourth prince had spread throughout the entire imperial capital like a gust of wind. The 23rd prince had suddenly become the hot favorite in this contest for the throne. Many people who hadn't been optimistic about him had suddenly begun to favor him in quick succession. Moreover, they wanted to overwhelm him with resources. The 23rd prince's mansion had been a deserted place earlier, but it had suddenly flooded with a huge crowd. Many people wanted to curry favor with him, since he was the most powerful and popular prince at present. The 23rd prince would definitely remember those who had been good to him if he ascended the throne. Suddenly, a lot of people had arrived looking to join his faction, even though it had collapsed and disappeared when he had been chased down by the people. Everyone had left him like the rats leave a sinking ship at that time. But he had suddenly gained the limelight now, so he had attracted a lot of people as a result. The 23rd prince, Yi Shiwen, Wood Dragon, and several other people who had now become the core members of his faction had gathered in a private room inside the 23rd prince's mansion. We have become a huge force like the big prince, second prince, and other people since we've crushed the fourth prince's faction. And we've also become an eyesore for many forces. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze across everyone and said, it was 23rd prince's faction. However, Yi Shiwen had become the core figure of the entire faction of the 23rd prince after that day's stunning performance, even though he hadn't asked for that. Yi Shiwen didn't care about ordinary affairs. However, they would still seek his advice on big matters, and they would always get unexpected answers whenever they'd ask him for advice. Conspiracy, military strategy and tactics, government's politics. Yi Shiwen had casually grasped these concepts at his fingertips, so he would come up with unexpected solutions. Everyone was impressed with Yi Shiwen. They had initially thought that he was only a high-handed hired goon that was trying to play the role of a consecrate expert. However, they hadn't thought that he could also play the role of an advisor. Moreover, he was nearly omnipotent. He could take care of all kinds of things with mastery. The 23rd prince had considered hiring Yi Shiwen as his advisor many times. In fact, he had also promised him that he would make him the prime minister if he succeeded in obtaining the throne in the future. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't tempted by this, so he had refused this offer. In fact, he gave no margin for discussion on this topic. Yi Ziwen's target was to reach the peak of martial arts. How? He could waste his time on these ordinary matters. In fact, he could casually settle these matters without putting much effort. He had stayed in Yuan School's library for a long time in the past. It wasn't that he hadn't studied anything about imperial governance, military strength and tactics, or how to handle government affairs, and so on. He had learnt the notes of the renowned experts of older generation by heart. The Great Yu State wasn't as huge as the Great Wei State. However, many a logic were connected and similar. Analogy dictates that one can easily grasp 100 laws if one can master a law. Therefore, it's not the time to resort to high-handed methods anymore. We have already revealed enough strength. Those who want to seek our help can come to us, and then we must build high walls, stock up a wide range of provisions, and slowly wait to be named the king. Yi Shiwen slowly stated the true words of rebellion. The 23rd prince's eyes shone as if he had gotten the right direction. These words were few. However, they had an intrinsic guiding property. These were few words. However, they were quite effective. He looked even more earnestly at Yi Shiwen. However, unfortunately, Yi Shiwen didn't have any interest in becoming his advisor. It wasn't that Yi Shiwen didn't understand the principle of remaining low-key and quietly accumulating strength. However, that old emperor was already taking his last breaths and could die any moment now. So, where was the time to slowly accumulate the strength? One must rope in whoever comes seeking help under normal situation if one doesn't have enough fame and prestige. This was the requirement of the long-lasting battles. It was like the Three Kingdoms periods when the forces of Chao, Sun, Lu, and Yuan had defeated Dongjua and made use of the reputation built on that victory to recruit countless talents. The 23rd prince had already obtained enough reputation and prestige after he had defeated the entire force of the 4th prince. Therefore, the geniuses who were optimistic about him had already arrived. Plus, he had also accepted the majority of the 4th prince's remaining forces, and his own force had expanded by a considerable margin as a result. He must maintain a low profile in the coming time and bide his time until the right time was upon. It would be difficult to avoid the opposition of other forces if he continued to resort to high-handed methods, and they would try to get rid of him as early as possible. Standing out wouldn't lead to good fate under every circumstance. The 23rd prince had tried to stand out in the past, but he obviously couldn't do anything else under those circumstances. However, he could have used such a strategy if his fame hadn't lacked that much in the first place. Our new tactic will be to quietly expand our strength, and then we will calmly wait for the times to change. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze across everyone and said, everyone knew what this so-called wait for times to change meant. The right time would be when the emperor would die. That would be a huge time of change. The Great Wei State didn't have its crown prince, so these princes would also have a chance. The Great Wei State's emperor could have held the power in his hands for at least more than 500 years in accordance with the very long lifespan of the martial arts experts. So, there had been no need to choose the next emperor so early. However, the emperor didn't expect that one accident could lead to the current situation where a group of princes would start fighting for the throne. Yi Shiwen secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Was it that simple to obtain the Northern Dipper organization's support? He must help the 23rd prince in obtaining the throne. Only then would his task be considered finished. Afterwards, the people of the Northern Dipper faction would arrive and take over the control. Then, Yi Shiwen wouldn't need to handle things here. There were many factions within the Northern Dipper organization as well. Yi Shiwen, Wood Dragon, and Qing Su were comparatively closer to each other. They were all in the Northern Dipper, but this area was regarded as the territory of Yi Shiwen and a few other people. So, the other members of the organization wouldn't dare to intrude because of tacit mutual understanding. In fact, Yi Shiwen could also get a share of profits from this territory in the future, and he was helping the 23rd prince so energetically in planning these things because of this reason only. He would also obtain many benefits if the 23rd prince ascended the throne, and these benefits would be far more than what was visible from outside. The 23rd prince hadn't accepted a large number of disciples after he had become the hot favorite, unlike what everyone had imagined. On the contrary, he had nearly stopped recruiting forces after he had received the force of the 4th prince. A large number of people were still standing outside the 23rd prince's mansion since they wanted to join his faction. They wanted to take advantage of the current situation since the final result of the contest hadn't come out, and they wanted to get mixed in his faction during this time. After all, they would at least get to be the emperor's ministers if the outcome got swayed in their faction's favor. However, the 23rd prince's reluctance was contrary to many people's expectations. In fact, some forces of the 4th prince were seeking to join other princes, but the 23rd prince hadn't stopped them. In fact, it seemed as if he had ignored them in their entirety. However, only Yi Shiwen knew the reality. After all, Yi Shiwen had established the policies. So he knew that these people were opportunists and useless. The only thing that could decide the result of this contest for the throne was fighting with opponents by relying on one's military force. And these people were useless as a military force. These people would collapse and disappear at the first sight of failure. Thus, they were unreliable. Moreover, there would be no end to these people's greed if the 23rd prince were to mount the throne in the end. They would keep demanding more and more from him. The aftermath of 4th prince's death had quietened down after 1 month had passed. The 23rd prince and many other princes had divided the 4th prince's forces among themselves. The majority of the force had obviously fallen into the hands of the 23rd prince. However, a considerable part of the force had also fallen into the hands of other princes, and they had also reached their limits as a result. After all, the 4th prince had been operating his forces for over 100 years, so their foundation was incredibly profound. How would it have been that easy to complete this partition if the backbone of the 4th prince's faction hadn't been broken by Yi Shiwen along with the death of the 4th prince himself? However, the entire imperial capital looked even more nervous. Many people were guessing that the 23rd prince's tightly hidden force might emerge all of a sudden. After all, the moment of final announcement was drawing near. No news about the emperor was disseminated inside the imperial palace at first. However, some news eventually came out. Someone had gone and knocked the doors of Imperial City Watchtower for the treatment of the emperor's injury. They had visited and requested the imperial clan's old ancestor of Great Sage Realm to move into action and provide treatment to the emperor's injuries. After all, the emperor's force was bigger than the forces of all the princes. They were the royalist force. They had flourished because of the emperor. They had obtained the love and trust of the emperor, and thus they had been able to reach till here. The other people wouldn't suffer the biggest loss if the emperor died suddenly. However, these loyalists would. After all, every prince had their own members. So they would use their own members instead of these old officials of the late emperor if they obtained the throne. And these old loyalists were mostly worried about this thing. Therefore, it would be better if they could think of a method to treat the old emperor's injuries rather than trying their lucks on whichever prince would win. So they were clear that the old ancestor of Great Sage Realm would treat the injuries of the emperor in this critical situation. It had been said that this old ancestor of Great Sage Realm was the founder of the Great Wei State. He had disappeared a long time ago, and he had only reappeared on few occasions when the Great Wei State was in a situation of crisis. An entire country was about to extinguish. Moreover, it had been said that he used to live in a secret world and would remain submerged in closed-door training most of the time. However, these people had gone out to look for this old ancestor of the Great Sage Realm in the hope that he would act. However, Soon the news spread out that this old ancestor of the great sage realm was also helpless and couldn't treat the injuries of the emperor. And this news had declared the destruction of the emperor's force. The ambitious princes had begun to become restless as a result. However, another piece of news suddenly got transmitted soon enough. The eldest prince had rushed into the palace in rebellion. He had suddenly led his entire force and had rushed into the palace. He had then raided the imperial palace in order to seize the throne. And another piece of news vigorously transmitted soon after that happened. The eldest prince had been defeated. And the reason for his defeat was that the imperial palace's old ancestor of the great sage realm had attacked. He had personally attacked and suppressed the eldest prince since he had rushed inside the palace. And the eldest prince was defeated as a result. A myriad of rumors started to spread around as a result. And this caused a lot of confusion. To be continued. Chapter 510. The imperial capital was facing turbulent times these days. The quick and drastic changes had dazzled everyone. Nobody could see the situation clearly. It seemed as if they were in a smoke screen. First, the fourth prince had been killed. Then, the 23rd prince had risen to fame abruptly. And the eldest prince had led his troops into the palace immediately after that. However, the great sage ancestor had suppressed him with ease in the palace. No matter how powerful the eldest prince was, he had been suppressed easily by the great sage expert when they had met face to face. He hadn't been able to resist even a bit and had been suppressed completely as a result. The eldest prince's forces had suffered a stinky bloodbath. This clearly showed the interest of this forgotten old ancestor when it came to keeping the empire stable. The fighting among those princes was one thing. However, daring to invade the imperial palace was a capital offense. It was a dead end. The entire imperial capital had been shaken up, and many forces had also chickened up all of a sudden. The forces that wanted to stir up trouble by taking advantage of this contest among many princes had suddenly gone silent, in particular, since nobody wanted to bear the rage of the great sage ancestor. Everyone had become jittery inside the 23rd prince's mansion upon the arrival of that founder of the great sage realm. All forces had restrained their actions, no matter whether they were ambitious or not. The 23rd prince's faction wasn't an exception either. They had been warned and prohibited from going out and stirring up trouble. Any issue might trigger the anger of that old great sage at this time. The pending matters of the empire had been quickly resolved after the return of this great sage elder. He was worthy of being called the founder emperor. After all, he had resolved so many pending matters very quickly. So the empire was back on the right track as a result. Everyone had understood one thing. Any military operation had become insignificant with the return of this great sage ancestor. Could these so-called powerful subordinates of the princes contend against a great sage expert? Those ambitious princes were as inexperienced as young chicks in front of this great sage expert. After all, he was the martial emperor of the Wei state. He was the one who had laid the foundation of the Wei state in those chaotic times. So, it was simply ridiculous to compare him with these inexperienced princes. Everyone had understood that it was no longer possible to mount the throne by competing against each other by depending upon their forces. Instead, it was possible only with the favor of the martial emperor of the Wei state. Everything would be pointless even if those princes had a bloodbath. In fact, he might not care even if all of them died. He might randomly extend support to another person from the imperial clan in obtaining the throne. And why wouldn't he? After all of them were his descendants. Perhaps those courtiers used to differentiate between relatives and strangers. However, all those people were his descendants in his eyes. Then, what's the discrimination between close and distant relatives? The people of the Great Wei State believed that their nation was safe and sound as long as the martial emperor of the Wei State was alive. And perhaps the entire Great Wei State would collapse and fall apart once he died. This case was similar to the one with the old founders in the Yi Yuan school. Many people believed that he had already died in a seated posture. However, they hadn't expected that he would still be alive after having extended his life with the help of a secret technique. It was a big sacrifice on his part to continue living in the present world. He would have suffered unbearable pain by continuing to live on with the help of some secret technique. One would have to endure pain every day and night if they used this technique. Anyway, it would have been impossible if he didn't have the will of iron and a stone-like perseverance. Moreover, he had endured such pain because he might have to fight for the sake of Yi Yuan school one day. This had left people to admire this senior predecessor. They found him svelte and peerless. Even his last glorious battle was brilliant enough to be written down in the annals of the Yi Yuan school. It had then been spread among the people of all generations. He had appeared very abruptly in the Yi Yuan school in their most difficult time. The senior experts, teachers, and all the fellow students were in danger at that time. The Yi Yuan school was in a hopeless situation. However, he had stood up firmly at that time. He had become the strongest pillar for the Yi Yuan school when it was on the verge of a collapse. Several hundred years of fighting had killed the prestige of the Yi Yuan school. However, he had single-handedly pacified the calamity of the Yi Yuan school. He had led the expeditions of the Yi Yuan school throughout his life, and he had died leading an expedition of the Yi Yuan school. Even his enemies hadn't dared to disrespect him for this reason. Perhaps death was also a kind of relief for him. Yi Zaiwen's present strength had surpassed that old founder's from back then. However, he still had respect for him in his heart. At present, things had changed and become simpler for many people of the Great Wei State since the martial emperor of the Wei State had returned. Everything appeared blurred like layer upon layer of blood fog before his arrival. It wasn't even clear how many fights they would have to experience in order to see the outcome. However, everything depended on the decision of Wei State's martial emperor at this time. So, they would have to experience less turmoil now. However, it was a big problem for Yi Shiwen. A great sage expert had interfered, and this had suddenly left him to feel that he wasn't in a favorable position to use his skills. His former strategy dictated that they would wait for the old emperor to die. Then they would fight for the throne, and the 23rd prince could ascend to the throne as long as he could kill those other princes, and this ascension would be perfectly justifiable. However, who cared about that old emperor's life or death now? It didn't matter whether he was dead or alive. The crucial point was the attitude of the martial emperor of the Wei State. There would be no problem if he supported the 23rd prince. However, what should be done if he didn't? Yi Shiwen also became somewhat frantic while facing this situation. In fact, he had even rashly thought that he would ask the Northern Dipper organization to send a great sage expert. The Northern Dipper organization didn't have too many members. However, there were many great sage experts in that organization. In fact, many great sage experts were even present among the peripheral members. After all, the official members were mostly top-tier Heaven's Pride experts. Therefore, they could at least cultivate up to the perfection level of the great sage realm if they didn't come across any calamity. However, the peripheral members were also a group of geniuses. They weren't some unnecessary people who could be used for dealing with small matters. Nothing can be done in this matter since things have reached this stage. The voice of the wood dragon made a buzzing sound after it passed through the mask as he said this. Initially, there was no problem since Yi Shiwen was keeping watch. However, even Yi Shiwen couldn't do much now. Great Sage, this name was enough to represent everything. Great Sage was considered the pinnacle of power in many big worlds. It was also considered the mainstay of a force. Wood Dragon didn't want other people of the Northern Dipper organization to arrive and interfere. After all, he wanted to run this place of the Wei State as his own nest. The so-called practice was the cultivation of law, loyalty, wealth, and land. He, Yi Shiwen, and Qing Su didn't wish to establish their own secret little force on the side. Therefore, the best way to earn loyalty and resources was to help a force, and it was a very good option as long as they could reap benefits and wealth at regular intervals. However, they didn't have any other way if the situation had reached that extent. After all, it was still better than the failure of the mission. The wood dragon couldn't help but hold his forehead either. He was quite depressed by these events. Unexpected things had been happening again and again. The 23rd prince has also entered the palace, so we will soon come to know what the present regulations are. Yi Shiwen was leaning against the edge of a big tree as he said. Breeze blew the hem of his robe. It was a bit cold. He didn't wish to call more people either. The majority of people apart from him and the wood dragon could very well be considered as outsiders. He had also considered that he might attract the attention of the meteor sect if he called more people to get rid of the Wei State's martial emperor. The death of one or two sage experts wasn't a big thing. It wasn't that the sage experts didn't have any importance in the meteor sect. However, they weren't very significant either. But it would be very surprising if the meteor sect didn't investigate the matter in case a great sage expert were to die here. This was also the reason why this task had been handed over to two inexperienced newcomers like the wood dragon and Yi Shiwen. Many people would have wanted to get such a good task. In fact, there wouldn't have been so many unnecessary troubles if a great sage expert had received this task. Moreover, they wouldn't have required making countless plans like Yi Shiwen. In fact, they would have had only one plan. Kill all those who don't accept their decision. They would have continued to slaughter until the people had started to obey their commands. And this task would have been complete without hassles as a result. The 23rd prince had been invited to the palace by the Wei State's martial emperor this morning. The other princes who had been fighting for the throne had also been invited along with him. It seemed as if the Wei State's martial emperor was planning to put his cards on the table. He also didn't seem interested in these ordinary affairs and needless entanglements. After all, he wouldn't have left the position of emperor and fled to the meteor sect if that was the case. Yi Shiwen hadn't accompanied the 23rd prince. After all, who would dare to assassinate a prince before the eyes of the martial emperor of the Wei State? Therefore, safety was guaranteed. Moreover, Yi Shiwen was also afraid of a possible situation. What would happen if the Wei State's martial emperor were to lose his temper and capture the prince? Who would go to rescue him in that case? We must withdraw if there is any issue. Damn it! The mission description never said that there is going to be a great sage expert involved. The wood dragon spoke up in a complaining manner. The worldly affairs are unpredictable. We must be prepared to counter every move as and when they occur. Yi Shiwen replied. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps sounded. Both individuals looked towards the gate to see who it was. One must know that both these individuals had honorable statuses inside the prince's mansion. In fact, ordinary people wouldn't even dare to go in the courtyard where these two men used to dwell. Soon, a middle-aged attendant dressed in attendant's clothes arrived in front of both these individuals. He saluted them and said, "Respected consecrate experts, someone is looking for the respectable dragon consecrate outside." Yi Shiwen recognized this person. He was a reliable subordinate of the 23rd prince's. He was also an internal attendant inside the prince's mansion. It was said that he had been accompanying 23rd prince since many years. He had luckily escaped at the time when the 4th prince had been chased down, and then he had again returned to prince's mansion and had taken charge of the internal matters of the mansion. He didn't dare to lack any manners in front of these two senior experts. He also possessed martial arts cultivation. In fact, he possessed the strength of legendary realm. However, he knew that these two senior experts could poke him to death with a finger. Moreover, they had a good relation with his master, and he himself could go a step further and become a main figure in the imperial palace if his master were to ascend the throne. "Who is looking for me?" Yi Shiwen asked. "The dragon consecrate." That's what he was called by people in the prince's mansion to differentiate him among these two. It's President Jiang. He's the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters of the Great Wei State. The internal attendant replied in a respectful manner. What does he want? Yi Shiwen frowned. He obviously knew who this Great Wei State's Association of Alchemy Masters was. It was a huge organization that comprised of the alchemy masters of the Great Wei State. The people of this organization could be found everywhere in the entire Great Wei State. A huge portion of this group comprised of alchemy masters. They were very exceptional. They had numerous and complicated contact networks. He knew a bit about this force because he initially wanted the 23rd Prince to rope in this force. And this President Jiang was the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters. He enjoyed a huge reputation in the entire Great Wei State. Nobody dared to underestimate the capabilities of this Association of Alchemy Masters. Many people had received the benefits of the Association of the Alchemy Masters. He had wanted for the 23rd Prince to rope in this force. However, they hadn't gotten enough time to act on it, and now it was them who had come to pay a visit. I would gladly see you since you've come here to meet me. To be continued. Chapter 511. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters because he enjoyed a huge reputation in the Great Wei Empire. Rather, it was fact that this organization wasn't only limited to the Great Wei Empire or the Meteor World. In fact, it also had its branches in the true martial world, even though it very far from this place. It was an incomparably huge organization that was spread across the entire world. Even the records of the Northern Dipper organization showed that it was an incomparably terrifying organization. Yi Shiwen followed the internal attendant to the living room. He saw the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters, Jiang Zhouqing. Yi Shiwen had also found out some of the information about this president of the Association of Alchemy Masters while on his way to this place. Jiang Zhouqing was regarded as a legendary figure in the entire Great Wei Empire. A great master of alchemy had once arrived in the Great Wei Empire in the past. He was Jiang Zhouqing's master. However, Jiang Zhouqing had taken over the Association of Alchemy Masters and had become the president of this association after that great master of alchemy had departed. The Association of Alchemy Masters had almost collapsed and fallen apart after the departure of that great master. However, it had slowly come back to life again under his leadership. And then it had become a giant force in the entire Great Wei Empire. Yi Shiwen saw Jiang Zhouqing and found out that he was a semi-sage expert. He was clad in a gorgeous robe. He was looking quite graceful and elegant. He had a childish face. Jiang Zhouqing stepped forward towards Yi Shiwen without waiting for Yi Shiwen to step forward. He then cupped his hands in obeisance and said, "This junior scholar has come to greet the great master dragon." That internal attendant was left dumbstruck. He hadn't expected that something like this could happen. What kind of a person was Jiang Zhouqing? He didn't possess too much strength. However, he could be regarded as a very high-handed person. His contact network was spread throughout the entire Great Wei Empire. Even the emperor had never ignored him whenever they came across each other, because even he had many requirements from him. Moreover, an association of even more terrifying alchemy masters was behind him. Therefore, he hadn't expected that this man would greet Yi Shiwen like he himself was a disciple of the younger generation. This was different from showing casual respect. After all, he had greeted Yi Shiwen in this manner, and this meant that he considered himself inferior to Yi Shiwen. In fact, this meant that he treated Yi Shiwen as a senior. However, Yi Shiwen didn't feel anything strange in that. He sat down in front of Jiang Zhouqing in a carefree manner. He didn't walk on the road of those alchemy masters. However, he also knew that there weren't many great masters of alchemy present in the Association of Alchemy Masters. Moreover, they were even fewer in number than the sage experts. Therefore, they were as precious a treasure as a great sage expert was. The person who could refine the graded pills was called as Great Master of Alchemy. Great Masters of Alchemy could get respect wherever they'd go. And a rumor had spread everywhere in the entire imperial capital that he was a great master of alchemy. After all, almost the entire city had got to see a live broadcast of that day's alchemy incident because of the fourth prince's invasion. Basically, that incident had become public. Therefore, it was very easy to understand Jiang Zhouqing's attitude. Any great master of alchemy was enough to obtain people's respect. And these people didn't know that Yi Shiwen was a fake alchemy master. Would Great Master Dragon like to enroll in our association? Jiang Zhouqing asked. The Association of the Alchemy Masters was an organization that was formed by a group of alchemy masters. However, not all alchemy masters could enroll there, or could have a strong say in the association. The Association of Alchemy Masters was the same as the Northern Dipper organization. They didn't force anyone to join their group. However, one could sell their own refined pills there. One could also purchase the drug ingredients from there. In fact, one could also purchase rare drug ingredients by accepting a task. Therefore, there was still a great number of alchemy masters who were still wandering destitute far from home. In fact, there had been many whose existence had never been known to anyone. Yi Shiwen shook his head. Was it a joke? He obviously knew many pill-making methods. However, he couldn't refine too many immortality pills in reality. Moreover, he didn't wish to walk on the road of alchemy. So, how could he possibly enroll in the Association of Alchemy Masters? It's such a pity. A talented person like you will be considered as a guest of honor by our organization. Jiang Zhouqing spoke up in a disappointed manner. However, he didn't say much about this. However, I would like to request the Great Master to help us in a matter since I have presumptuously made a visit. Jiang Zhouqing said. However, he didn't continue to nag when it came to Yi Ziwen's enrollment issue, because it was pointless to do that. Yi Shiwen listened to him. He wasn't a great master of alchemy. However, he also knew that it couldn't be a small matter since it appeared to have alarmed a great master of alchemy. The thing is that my teacher has recently obtained a secret pill, making prescription of an ancient immortality pill. However, he's afraid that he isn't strong enough to refine it on his own. Therefore, we have informally invited our close friends for conducting a small-scale alchemy meeting in order to investigate the details of this pill-making method. Would you be interested? Jiang Zhouqing asked. An ancient immortality pill? Are the other great masters of alchemy also coming? Yi Shiwen asked. Many pill-making methods had been lost since the ancient times because of various expeditions. The masters of alchemy would often conduct such seminar between themselves. Yes, it has been ascertained that about 6 to 7 great masters of alchemy will come. I know that you don't wish to enroll in our association. However, this is a grand occasion for all the fellow alchemy masters who have the same beliefs, and we want all those who share the same belief as ours to come for this meet. Jiang Zhouqing said. His teacher was obviously the only legendary great master of alchemy of the Great Wei Empire. However, it was said that he had left the Great Wei Empire a long time ago. Moreover, nobody knew about his whereabouts. However, it seemed as if Jiang Zhouqing was aware of his whereabouts. A great master of alchemy was truly precious. They were as important as a great sage expert. And this was still true for a low-ranked great master of alchemy. He would have been exceptionally precious if he were to be a high-ranked great master of alchemy. In fact, his name would have become sensational. Several great masters of alchemy were gathering together. Even the attendance of one such master was enough to make people rush. However, so many of them were going to assemble together. This might even impassion the entire meteor world. The internal attendant was waiting on the side, and he was watching this scene with full concentration. He sighed with emotion. Even the Wei Sate's imperial capital couldn't ignore a great master of alchemy. However, several such masters were arriving in one place in this instance. So, The entire Great Way State would begin to flare up if this news spread out, including the news that such a highly reputed person like Jiang Zhouqing had personally arrived to invite Yi Shiwen. "And I will be there on time." Yi Shiwen replied. He had thought for a moment, and had then decided to go and have a look. The great masters of alchemy were very rare to come across. So it was the time for him to make friends. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid that he would get exposed. He knew all kinds of pill-making methods and alchemy techniques. In fact, he had casually grasped even those kinds of pill-making methods and alchemy techniques, which those great masters of alchemy couldn't even spell out. So it could be said that he had mastered this subject. Therefore, he wasn't worried. He wouldn't even have to worry in case they asked him to refine some immortality pills. After all, he could do that on the spot. This wasn't an issue for him as long as he had the mysterious space. That's wonderful. We will personally send an invitation card to invite Great Master Dragon when the time comes. An excited look appeared on the face of Jiang Zhouqing. He was quite down to earth, even though he was considered as an extraordinary person in the entire Great Way Empire. Moreover, he wouldn't dare to act rudely in front of Yi Shiwen, since he considered the latter to be a great master of alchemy. In fact, he believed that Yi Shiwen and his teacher were at the same level. Jiang Zhouqing informed Yi Shiwen about the time once it was decided that he would be coming. He said that this meeting would take place after 2 to 10 years. The reason why the time had been fixed after 2 to 10 years was that it would take a fair amount of time to collect those drug ingredients. And this meeting wasn't being conducted to discuss about the feasibility of this ancient prescription alone. In fact, they also wanted to refine it on the spot. This was an extraordinary pill-making method. Therefore, several great masters of alchemy must gather and refine it together in the hope that they would succeed in the first attempt. This duration of time was enough for Yi Shiwen. 2 to 10 years' time would be more than enough to settle the matter of the 23rd prince, and then he could leave for this pill-processing meeting. In fact, this meeting could possibly take place after the competition of the core disciples. The 23rd prince had gone to visit the imperial palace, and he returned not long after Jiang Zhouqing had left. However, he looked a bit disappointed. Just as Yi Shiwen had expected, the Wei State's martial emperor had laid out his cards on the table in front of the princes. However, he didn't appoint anyone as the successor as Yi Shiwen had thought. However, many had been counting this as the biggest reason behind this meeting. He had only made the princes well-behaved. Then, who could be the successor of the emperor? He would slowly observe them for half a year, and then he would decide. Everyone looked at each other in the private room. They were speechless. They hadn't anticipated this outcome. The Wei State's martial emperor hadn't appointed anyone. Rather, he had said that he wanted to observe the performances of all the princes. However, nobody could call this reason an excuse. After all, this old ancestor had been in the closed-door training since many years. So, he obviously didn't know too much about these princes. Someone had also guessed that this martial emperor of Wei State was using this last resort to revitalize the current emperor. It was said that the current emperor had obtained the throne under the guidance of this martial emperor of the Wei State. Therefore, it was evident how much he cared about him. Nobody knew what the Wei State's martial emperor was thinking in reality. However, other people couldn't say anything since he had said so. Time passed day by day, and 1 month's time had passed in a wink. It seemed as if everything had returned back to normal. Everyone was thinking that this would continue for half a year. However, an incident suddenly occurred, and it completely disrupted the initial peace and tranquility of the imperial capital. A huge meteor fell from the sky. It pounded on a remote mountain that was located deep within the domain of the Great Wei State. The huge impact razed the mountain to the ground. Moreover, several nearby cities had submerged into the dust and debris that was produced by the terrifying shockwave, and many experts and ordinary people in these cities met an untimely death within a split second as a result. This sudden occurrence had shaken the entire Great Way State. Someone had found out that a huge crater had been formed after the meteorite had crashed. In fact, it was so deep that its base wasn't visible. The most terrifying thing was that some strange creatures had come out from it crawling. Then, someone had recognized these creatures, and one name had started to echo in the entire Great Way State after that: a bereaved race. To be continued. Chapter 512. A bereaved race. This name initially sounded rather strange to most people. However, many people also had recognized this name. Many experts who possessed outstanding strength knew that the human race wasn't the aboriginal inhabitant of this world. Instead, this species was the aboriginal inhabitant of this world. However, these aboriginal inhabitants had also gradually disappeared before everyone's eyes after they had experienced intense battles with the ancestors of the human race for countless years. Therefore, these species had gradually transformed into a mere name for everyone: a bereaved race. An incredible and bloody battle had occurred between the ancestors of human race and the bereaved race at that time. But it wasn't clear for how many thousand years this era of turmoil had continued before it had gradually quietened down. It could be said that rivers of blood had been spilled. It wasn't clear how many individuals had died on both sides. The bereaved had been completely wiped out at that time. But it wasn't clear how many years ago this had happened. In fact, many people had already forgotten this name long ago. These bereaved would occasionally come into existence. However, their quantity was always very less. Therefore, only the name of bereaved had survived. Therefore, many people didn't know much about the bereaved. Even those experts of Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm weren't an exception. In fact, most people basically didn't know anything about them. However, this name had again appeared on everyone's mouth along with the appearance of that heavenly crater. After all, traces of the bereaved race had been found inside that heavenly pit. This news had quickly spread across the entire Great Way State. It had also alarmed the entire meteor sect because the appearance of the bereaved could possibly sway the rule of the entire meteor sect. In fact, it could even affect the rule of the entire human race. Nobody dared to underestimate these bereaved. They didn't have clear evidence. However, the human race had faced turmoil many times in the past because of these bereaved. Therefore, the people had gotten scared since these bereaved had been found. Soon, a message got disseminated from the martial emperor of the Way State. He had previously wanted to examine the princes. However, he didn't want to examine them anymore. In fact, he had asked them to go inside that heavenly pit. Whoever would find the news of the arrival of the elusive bereaved first would be appointed as the next emperor of the Great Way Empire. And this information had incited all those ambitious princes who were fighting for the title of emperor. This had nothing to do with strength. It looked as if whoever would find out the news of bereaved first and report back would inherit the title of emperor. We can't miss this chance. This is the best opportunity, Yi Shiwen said. He had quickly realized that this was the best opportunity for the 23rd prince. In fact, this was an opportunity that could lay the foundation of a dynasty. The martial emperor of the Way State didn't care about the position of the emperor. However, the news about the appearance of the bereaved would have alarmed the meteor sect. And he could obtain the meteor sect's reward if he got hold of the information before the others. And that would certainly help him in cultivating further. However, you won't be going there. Wood Dragon, and I will go instead. Yi Shiwen addressed the 23rd prince. The 23rd prince was merely an expert of the semi-sage realm. Therefore, the plan of Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon would go in vain if the prince died by accident. In any case, the martial emperor of the Way State only cared about the news. Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon didn't delay much. The important thing was to obtain the information firsthand before anyone else. Moreover, it seemed as if the number of bereaved that had appeared might not be too many. Otherwise, the martial emperor of the Way State would have personally moved into action. Moreover, other countries would also send their experts after some time, and their advantage would be gone by that time. However, both individuals hadn't even set off when they received an order from the Northern Dipper organization. The organization had asked them to thoroughly examine the situation inside this heavenly crater. Had bereaved genuinely appeared there or not? These two individuals hurriedly traveled across half of the Great Way State, and they soon arrived in the Lusong city. This city was nearest to that heavenly crater. The Lusong city had recently experienced a brutal battle, so the blood of unknown beasts was sprayed on the entire city wall. It was looking exceptionally dismal under the light of the setting sun. It seems that this locality has experienced a violent war. Yi Shiwen looked at the chopped flesh and limbs above the city wall as he said, I've just got the news that this city has experienced the raid of ancient demon beasts. It is said that many ancient demon beasts have come out crawling from that heavenly crater. It is said that they had already vanished from this world many years ago. The wood dragon replied, These ancient demon beasts had only existed in the records. Many such beasts had been annihilated by the ancestors of the human race in the past. The ancestors of the human race had faced an incredibly harsh environment when they had arrived in this world. Moreover, those bereaved had only been a part of it. In fact, it wasn't even known how many high-handed powerhouses of older generation had been slaughtered by those ancient demon beasts. This is kind of startling, the wood dragon said. Many forces would arrive because of the appearance of the bereaved. So, this matter would only become more and more complicated. These two individuals entered the city very easily because no soldier was keeping watch. That was because the soldiers had been slaughtered by a recent wave of the ancient demon beasts which had burst into the city. In fact, not many ordinary people were left there either. Most of them had run away. The people who were still there in the city at this moment were the bold and daring experts. Most of them were the experts of the truth, great, complete realm. In fact, they could only be considered at the bottom rank in this city which was full of experts. Many sage experts were also present among them. Auras of some of these experts seemed weakened due to distance, while some still seemed powerful. All of them were outstanding experts of the same rank. However, there wasn't any great sage expert present among them. Perhaps the situation hadn't reached to the extent that it needed the presence of the great sage experts. After all, the arrival of a few bereaved wasn't enough to alarm the great sage experts. The two individuals went to a restaurant after they entered the city. The owner of this restaurant had already fled. Only the experts were left and were taking rest here. They were whispering among themselves as they discussed about all kinds of gossips and news that had rushed in from everywhere. I don't know what is at the bottom of that heavenly crater that so many ancient demon beasts have come out crawling from it. These ancient demon beasts must be much more powerful than the ones in this world. Can there be an ancient world concealed inside of it? Someone speculated. The so-called ancient world was a kind of microcosm or a region that had remained isolated from the rest of the world because of some reason. Therefore, many organisms which had gone extinct in the present age were often found lurking inside these regions or microcosms. Such ancient worlds weren't seen very frequently. However, their numbers were certainly large. It wasn't known for how long the calamity of war had ravaged the world since the ancient times. Many almighty experts had broken entire stars into countless pieces with a mere slap. So, that insanely fierce battle must have shattered the world into fragments. And these fragments were now home to a huge number of such extinct creatures. It's hard to say. However, nobody has found any trace of these creatures since so many years. So, how would we have come to know that so many ancient demon beasts lived underground if that meteor hadn't fallen from the sky? Whoever has tried to go inside so far has met a violent death, someone regretfully spoke up. I've heard that a random cultivator with no background of the initial stage of the sage realm has died a tragic death therein. He had gone inside recently, and I heard his endless, miserable screams. So, I reckon he must met a violent death inside. Many people trembled with fear as they heard this. An expert of the initial stage of the Sage Realm had gone inside and met such a tragic end. Suddenly, the thought of rushing inside had extinguished from the minds of many Truth Realm experts. A Sage expert had died so miserably. However, they were mere Truth Realm experts. Those talks make it seem like a big and ominous underground place. The Wood Dragon softly spoke to Yishiwen. They had changed their clothes after they had come out of the imperial capital. So, they weren't wearing the ostentatious uniforms of the Northern Dipper organization anymore. Yishiwen nodded. The most dreadful thing wasn't that something had killed the expert of the initial stage of the Sage Realm. Rather, it was the fact that it was the unknown. They didn't know anything. So, they didn't know what ominous things could be lurking down there. We will have to find a way and explore this place. The great sage experts will possibly arrive here quickly if this place genuinely has some startling secret. Yishiwen replied. Only some sage experts were present inside the city at this time. However, this didn't mean that those great sage experts didn't care about this matter. We could presently be in a city which might have a massive underground pit of treasures, if that's the case. However, this isn't certain. Wouldn't it be better if we can dig somewhere and confirm? Someone proposed an idea. How it can be so simple. We may find the ancient world if we dig here. Moreover, it's very difficult to deal with those ancient demon beasts. How we will stop those beasts if a lot of them came out at once? It wasn't that nobody had thought to drill the ground and enter that ancient world. However, nobody had dared to do that. After all, they wouldn't be able to stop those beasts if several of them came out of the pit, and it might even give rise to a startling turmoil. It wasn't clear how many people would die in this turmoil. Therefore, nobody had dared to casually bear the deed of such caliber. Meteors appeared in the sky and filled the entire horizon while everyone was still discussing this matter. It was a magnificent sight to behold. Suddenly, everyone's gaze fell on those meteors as they streaked across the horizon. Experts with formidable auras were riding those meteors, and they were flying directly towards that heavenly crater. These are the meteor sect's experts, right? Someone asked. The meteor sect was the leading force of the meteor world. Meteor sect alone was a massive force. However, this didn't mean that there were no other sects and forces. Moreover, there were numerous random cultivators with no backgrounds. However, these forces couldn't sway the dominance of the meteor sect. Yes, they are. I've heard that those meteors are the ancient flying tools of the meteor sect. They're known as the flying fire meteors. Their flying speed is very fast. So, they're most appropriate for traveling somewhere quickly. Someone recognized and said, they look like a group of glorious stars every time they go out and come in. These divine tools are specially made for traveling anywhere quickly. This meteor sect genuinely deserves to be the super force that leads our entire meteor world. Nobody can match this background. Someone sighed with emotion and said, divine tools were exceptionally precious for the majority of experts. And often, divine tools were entirely used in battles for combat purposes. However, divine tools that were made for other purposes were very small in number. Therefore, even the tools which had been used in several battles were good to use. Hence, this made it evident that the meteor sect was genuinely very rich and overbearing. To be continued. Chapter 5:13. However, only a small portion of the experts would get to use such extravagant devices, even if it's the meteor sect we're talking about, someone explained. Other people heaved a sigh of relief, one after another. These people might have considered joining the meteor sect unconditionally if every expert of the meteor sect could have this type of divine tool of their own. However, it had to be said that the meteor sect wouldn't necessarily make use of these weak experts. After all, the meteor sect commanded the meteor world. They had very high standards, and an average person couldn't fulfill their strict entry requirements. Everyone's gazes fell upon meteor sect's people since they had just burst into the heavenly crater. Suddenly, numerous sounds of discussions echoed in the restaurant. The people of the meteor sect can't help but move into action. They are always the first ones to react every time the bereaved appears. Such a big troop has arrived this time after they heard that only a few bereaved may have appeared. Moreover, nobody in that group is below the sage realm. They are all extremely ferocious. Someone exclaimed, "Yeah, a large group of experts have also moved into action apart from the meteor sect. What are we doing here when such powerful experts are present here?" Someone unwillingly spoke up. One must put their life on stake if they were weak and wanted to gain some big fortune. A lot of people aren't able to sit still right now. Not many of the bereaved are left now. However, they still possess a lot of wealth that was handed down to them. So, whoever will grab those bereaved will certainly advance by leaps and bounds. They will obtain a startling heritage. Everyone guessed that the current situation might give rise to a bloody battle. After all, many experts had arrived. However, not many people would be getting the benefits in the end. So, these people might get killed and buried here. However, Yishiwin and Wood Dragon left the restaurant soon because the other people of the Imperial clan had also arrived. They looked grandiose. After all, they were also a big group of sage experts. In fact, their prestige wasn't less than that of those experts of the meteor sect. However, they didn't look as united as the experts of the meteor sect. In fact, every team looked entirely different from the other. Everyone knew that this moment must be the deciding moment of the contest. Whoever would obtain enough information on the bereaved would obtain the throne this time. And one would definitely clinch the title of emperor if they obtained exact information about the arrival of the bereaved. One would lose the advantage if they didn't act quickly and now. However, they had also heard that a sage expert had gone inside the heavenly pit and had died miserably screaming as a result. Therefore, they didn't dare to go inside the pit even if they had arrived. They had no choice but to think their next move once they had gathered here. The majority of princes hadn't arrived among their princely forces. They had only sent their most competent subordinates. After all, the majority of princes hadn't reached the sage realm themselves. Therefore, they could have lost their lives easily even if they had merely come in the way. However, a few princes had arrived still. I've heard that the 23rd brother has recently become very popular. He has recruited a ferocious great master of alchemy, and that great master has wiped out the 4th younger brother's force in a flash. An approximately 30-year-old young man steadily opened his mouth and said to the other princes, the way in which the other people were addressing him made it seemed that he was the 2nd prince. He had obviously become the eldest prince after the 4th prince was killed and the eldest prince was purged. He also had the biggest advantage and the maximum number of supporters. In fact, many rumors even stated that the biggest factor because of which the eldest prince had taken the risk to raid the imperial palace was that the 2nd prince had forced him to do so. He had left him to feel that he couldn't achieve anything by using ordinary methods against his younger brother. Therefore, he had no choice but to resort to extreme methods while facing competition from this 2nd prince. And he was suppressed by the Wei state's martial emperor in the end as a result. A lot of experts who had gathered around him were his subordinates, and most of them looked fierce. There were all kinds of people in that group. However, most of them were sage experts. In fact, these people had gained an outstanding reputation in the entire Great Wei Empire in their early age itself. It's very surprising. 4th brother was definitely obscure. However, his insight wasn't that bad. I wanted to recruit that dwarf tiger, but I hadn't thought that he would fall into the hands of the 4th brother. So his strength wasn't bad. However, he didn't turn out to be a match for that dragon master. In fact, he was killed in a few moves only. Even his sage-level sword couldn't protect him. To think that even a peak sage expert didn't turn out to be this dragon master's match. I wonder what his origin is. Another prince who was standing beside him opened his mouth and said, he looked a bit similar to the 2nd prince. However, He appeared somewhat frail in comparison. However, everyone knew that this was only a deceptive outward appearance because he was none other the third prince, and he had gained outstanding military achievements in the entire Great Way state. He had once gone into expeditions in all the directions and had extended the territory of the Great Way Empire. He was very dreadful in reality. There are so many experts in this world. What's strange if you don't know a few of them? There was another formidable-looking prince beside the third prince. His breath looked deep. His vision appeared like torch. His arms were muscular like those of an ape. His lower back was very sturdy like that of a bee. He was the seventh prince. Yi Shiwen noted that these three princes had the most following experts around them. These four princes used to have the most number of followers before the death of the fourth prince. However, the other princes' forces only had 1 or 2 sage experts by their sides to keep up appearances. Therefore, they would have no choice but to die in the contest if they had competed depending upon their strength. In fact, it would have been a dead end for them if they had done so. After all, such meager strength would have no other impact apart from fighting a hopeless battle. However, it wasn't a contest of strength anymore. Rather, it was a race to see who would find the information of the bereaved at first. One could climb to the position of the emperor with the support of the Wei state's martial emperor as long as they could find the information of the bereaved. Who would dare to have any objection? One's present strength might not be equal to that of other strong princes, but one could transfer the consecrate experts of the imperial clan under one's control after they had wielded the power of the country. Then the forces of these princes would be no match for the newly appointed emperor. Many princes looked like trashes in this contest for obtaining the throne. However, they also had such ambitions in their minds. An old man who was clad in dark clothes was quietly standing away from these princely forces. He had an incredibly formidable aura. Yi Shiwen knew that this man must be the consecrate expert of the imperial clan. The imperial clan had sent a very formidable consecrate expert, and he was leading these princely forces. However, it was clearly visible that these princes didn't care about this old consecrate. Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon had attracted many people's attention when they had arrived here, even though they had changed out of the moon-white robes of the Northern Dipper organization. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen heard the voice of the Wood Dragon at this time. Yi Shiwen, these princes are very courageous to have arrived here to die. After all, they have dared to appear here themselves. It's genuinely akin to courting death. These three princes are the biggest rivals of the 23rd prince now. Is there any need to be afraid of the competition if all of them are dead? After all, the other people aren't a match for the 23rd prince. Wood Dragon's idea suddenly stirred Yi Shiwen's thoughts. Everything had suddenly become clear before his eyes. The competition was intense, and it was hard to decide who would obtain the throne in the end. However, what if all the rivals were to die? What options would the Wei state's martial emperor have apart from declaring the 23rd prince as the emperor? This was the simplest and also the most direct method. And this method could be tested out. Well, look who we have here. Aren't those the 2 experts the 23rd has recruited? That man who has worn the dragon's mask is that so-called dragon master. I have heard that he's a great master of alchemy. In fact, even Jiang Zhou-Qing had personally arrived and invited him to participate in the pill processing meeting that would take place after many years. The second prince had sharp eyes. He had recognized Yi Shiwen in an instant. He sighed with emotion in his heart. He didn't want to recruit a great master of alchemy now alone. He would still wish to recruit a great master of alchemy even after he had become the emperor of the Great Way Empire. However, he hadn't expected that his 23rd younger brother would recruit one before him. I've heard that this great master of alchemy is apparently quite insane. Gee, 7th brother, you weren't present that day. So, you haven't seen him crossing the tribulation that day. It was an overwhelming tribulation cloud. I have never seen someone crossing such a sage realm tribulation. A smile appeared at the corner of the mouth of the third prince. He hadn't even shot a glance at the seventh prince as he had said this. The seventh prince was considered the top-notch expert of this generation in the imperial clan. He had become a supreme expert of the peak of sage realm at this young age. Moreover, he was only half a step away from entering the small perfection level of the sage realm. He was genuinely the most talented individual among the princes. However, he wasn't present in the city when Yi Shiwen was crossing the tribulation. He had gone out of the city because of some other matter. So what? He is only a great master of alchemy, nothing more. One can say that he is domestic dog of our imperial clan. The seventh prince spoke up in a disdainful tone. These princes currently didn't have too many powerful experts in their groups. However, many profound senior experts were present in the imperial clan. Everyone in the imperial clan had become an expert in order to maintain rule over this enormous Great Way state. It wasn't clear how many experts had taken birth in these many years and were hidden behind the scene. Just consider that old emperor who was hanging between life and death at present. He was also a senior sage expert. Therefore, the seventh prince believed that tidying up people like Yi Shiwen wouldn't be an issue if he were to ascend to the throne. The 23rd prince is a loser. He didn't even dare to come out on such a big occasion. He doesn't even have that much courage. How he can become the emperor of my Great Way state? The seventh prince sneered and said. He didn't care about the 23rd's robust force, which was in the favorable situation at present. However, the people who were present in the surroundings looked normal despite his remarks. So, it was clearly visible that they had already become accustomed to the supercilious seventh prince. What is extraordinary in having the support of the subordinates? I don't believe that this person who has recently crossed a sage realm tribulation can be extraordinary. A mysterious light flickered in the eyes of the seventh prince. However, he has reached the sage realm at such a young age. So, he must come across some fortuitous adventures, and he must hand over all of them to me. Only I deserve to have them. Yi Shiwen had barely entered the site and found that a murderous aura had suddenly locked down upon his body. He hadn't even reacted yet, and a battle spear had already been shot towards him. To be continued. Chapter 514. The spear wreaked havoc. It got bigger and bigger in Yi Zaiwen's line of vision, and it arrived in front of him within a split second to kill him. The spear issued a formidable aura, and it seemed as if a vast ocean had been forced upon a person's consciousness from the sky. It seemed as if the spear would nail and crucify Yi Shiwen to the ground. Yi Shiwen snorted and stretched out his hand. Then the fire clouds, falling sky, hand swept out. He had also gotten quite serious. He had realized that the seventh prince had launched an attack towards him almost immediately. The seventh prince was already at the peak of the sage realm. So he believed that he could conquer the entire world alone and didn't require the aid of a consecrate expert. He himself was enough to sweep away the entire world. Therefore, he only depended upon his powerful strength. That was why he was so supercilious. He didn't pay attention to the second prince and third prince. Perhaps he would have attacked those princes if he hadn't been restricted by the rules of the imperial clan. Yi Shiwen punched at a lightning-fast speed, and it rushed forward with the power of thunder. Then, Yi Shiwen hand-grabbed that spear like the low-hanging clouds that spread across the vast sky. Clang! Clang! The spear slipped into his hands to some distance, and a metal clanging sound was issued as a result. Yi Zaiwen's face exposed a contemptuous smile as he said, "Is that all you've got? Looks like nobody will be able to save you today." The veins in Yi Zaiwen's arm suddenly bulged out. He held that spear tightly in his hand and suddenly threw it back. Whiz! The spear issued incredibly sharp sound of breaking the void. Then it appeared as if a giant golden dragon had swept out towards the seventh prince. and it seemed as if it would crucify the seventh prince with certainty. The seventh prince saw that his offensive had failed to cause any effect. On the contrary, Yi Shiwen had blocked it with only one arm. Then Yi Shiwen had thrown that spear back with far more dreadful power than him. The irresistible force penetrated the space as if it were a mirror. The cracks proliferated in the entire space more quickly than the speed with which the spear had been shot, and the cracks had instantly spread out like a swift black dragon. "Don't you underestimate me." The seventh prince had realized that he may have kicked an iron wall this time. However, he had been behaving superciliously since many years. Therefore, how could he be willing to admit defeat this time? How would he have admitted that he wasn't better than Yi Shiwen, even though the latter had entered the sage realm very recently? One must know that Yi Shiwen had entered the sage realm. Moreover, he had crossed the sage realm tribulation under thousands of staring eyes of the entire imperial capital. So this was known to all. Roar! The seventh prince roared. The muscles of his hands suddenly bulged out. He unfolded his hands to catch that spear, even though it appeared like an incoming dragon. However, he didn't dare to catch that spear with one hand like Yi Shiwen had. Whoosh! The battle spear fell into his hands along with a tearing sound. It seemed as if a leather belt had peeled off the flesh. This collision didn't produce a metal clanging sound like it had when the spear had fallen into Yi Zaiwen's hand. In fact, the seventh prince was almost sent flying backwards by the impact of that spear. The skin of his palms was grated within a split second, and the tip of the spear had almost pierced his chest. Tap, tap, tap. The seventh prince couldn't control his feet and was forced to retreat several steps. He stepped backwards on the ground and left his huge footprints to trail in his wake. However, he couldn't stop the momentum of the spear. In fact, the entire spear was still wrapped with an incredibly tremendous force. Whoosh! A golden light flashed. Yi Shiwen suddenly appeared behind seventh prince. A big foot suddenly swept out and kicked downwards at the seventh prince's back. "Be careful!" the second and third prince promptly yelled. They used to be at each other's throats on ordinary days. However, that was their internal dispute. But Yi Shiwen was an outsider for all of them. However, they couldn't act on time. Yi Shiwen had already kicked their brother. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's kick struck seventh prince. Meanwhile, the tremendous force of the spear had also been pushing him from the opposite direction. Puchi! The seventh prince got caught between the two tremendous forces. However, he couldn't persist against their might. He couldn't hold that spear in his hand, and it penetrated into his chest, and blood splashed out and sprinkled the blue sky as a result. Bang! One end of the spear had ferociously pierced into the ground. A huge pit had been opened on the solid ground as a result, and the other end of the spear had penetrated the chest of the seventh prince. The seventh prince appeared in a strange situation. He opened his big eyes wide while hanging on the spear that had pierced his chest and nailed him to the ground. He couldn't believe this. He had been intensely proud of his strength. However, he had looked so vulnerable in front of Yi Shiwen. However, it didn't matter how unwilling he was. It was useless. After all, he had been crucified to the ground. So, it seemed he was destined for this outcome when he had decided to attack and kill Yi Shiwen. Perhaps he hadn't expected that the situation could turn out like this. After all, he had already entered the peak of the sage realm many years ago, and Yi Shiwen had recently entered the sage realm, and most importantly, he had never thought that Yi Shiwen would dare to fight back. After all, he was a prince, so he had the status of royalty, and Yi Shiwen was merely a consecrate expert of his 23rd brother. So, one could even say that Yi Shiwen was merely a servant if one were to speak in a coarse language. Therefore, he had believed that Yi Shiwen wouldn't dare to counterattack him. However, he hadn't thought that this could happen. He was supercilious and rampant. But Yi Shiwen was also a lawless person. He had killed the disciples of the law enforcement hall right after he had entered the true martial university. So, what was an insignificant prince to his eyes? Why, he wouldn't dare to counterattack. Even the wood dragon had also planned to kill all these people so that they could remove 23rd Prince's obstacles in acquiring the throne. Yi Shiwen felt an astonishing blade energy as it swept towards him from above. It shrouded him and chopped the space little by little. The golden divinities suddenly formed a pair of golden wings behind Yi Zaiwen's body. He disappeared without any trace in a flash and distanced himself from the onslaught of this blade energy. Bang! The long blade crashed into the ground and opened a huge crack. The crack proliferated for more than a dozen miles and went out of the city. Yi Shiwen raised his head to see. He found that it was the Imperial clan's old consecrate expert who had launched this attack. He was holding 4 long blades, and they had formed a terrifying array of blades. Moreover, each of those 4 long blades was a sage tool. He evidently possessed unfathomable strength. The old consecrate shot an ominous glare at him and said, "That was a good method. The 7th prince is the most talented person of the younger generation in the Imperial clan. However, you have completely dominated him. A person of your caliber must be very popular. But why have I never heard of you?" The old consecrate was looking at Yi Shiwen with a bit of doubt in his eyes. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen had suddenly emerged out of nowhere. He had never heard anything about Yi Shiwen. Other princes also had powerful consecrates in their factions, like the dwarf tiger who had initially disappeared for a long time. However, he had then reappeared in the 4th prince's faction. However, people could still search and obtain information about the dwarf tiger as long as they were determined. In fact, his information was no secret whatsoever. The dwarf tiger couldn't escape as long as people had taken the initiative to find out. Therefore, people had eventually found out about his whereabouts. However, Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon were different. They simply had no past records. Therefore, they couldn't find information on Yi Shiwen even though they had used the network of the entire Imperial clan. They weren't afraid of Yi Zaiwen's background. Instead, they were afraid of the fact that they couldn't look up his background. Yi Shiwen replied back, "What's strange in that? I had been picking drug ingredients in the depths of remote mountains for many years. I wasn't born here. It's quite normal if you don't know about it." Everyone was considering him as a great master of alchemy, so he also decided to act as one. However, he was secretly vigilant in his mind. In fact, he had already set his martial power at its max. This reply was omnipotent. After all, everyone knew that these alchemy masters used to roam inside old forests and deep mountains for many years. And only those alchemy masters who had the support of some big forces didn't do so. Otherwise, the other ones were always short of drug ingredients. So this was a common thing. However, Yi Shiwen still didn't dare to relax. After all, he might suffer a setback if that old guy suddenly launched another surprise attack. Yi Shiwen didn't care about those princes. However, this elusive old guy had really made him vigilant. In fact, that old guy could have scored the winning point in one shot a moment ago. And Yi Shiwen might have died if his movements had been any slower. After all, that old guy had resorted to extreme methods and hadn't showed any mercy. Yi Shiwen was alert. However, he wasn't very worried. He might not be able to defeat this old consecrate. However, he could escape his attacks as long as he wanted to. He had escaped from the hands of a great sage expert in the past, and he had been able to do that even when he hadn't even entered the semi-sage realm. However, one could say that he had also experienced a situation of life or death at that time. This old consecrate was certainly ferocious. However, he still couldn't be compared with a great sage expert. Who in the world is this man? I can't believe those alchemy masters can be so ferocious. The 3rd and 2nd prince used their divine sense to communicate with each other. They weren't convinced that Yi Shiwen was genuinely an alchemy master. After all, it wasn't that they didn't know about the fighting strength of alchemy masters. Alchemy masters couldn't scare people with their own strength. In fact, their strength often wasn't equal to that of a martial expert of the same rank. However, the thing that made everyone scared was their huge network of connections. 1 or 2 senior experts might appear for their help at any time if someone attacked them, especially if someone attacked those great masters of alchemy. And the said attacker would then be in an enormous amount of trouble. However, Yi Zaiwen's performance had completely toppled the impression of the alchemy masters that they had formed in their minds. In fact, this was simply ridiculous. Why would these people have been so confused if all the alchemy masters were so frightening? They weren't convinced that he was a great master of alchemy. However, his frightening battle strength was undeniable. Therefore, it was possible that there could be some other reason to it. There has to be a different reason. All of you know what kind of strength 7th younger brother possesses. He is the top-notch expert of the younger generation of our Imperial clan, and there's no doubt about it. However, he appeared like a toy in front of this man. This man has completely dominated him. Such strength! Gee, I don't know where the 23rd brother has recruited him from. The second prince sighed and said, how come he hadn't come across such a person? This man is a huge threat. Moreover, I can see that this man is also very ambitious. The 23rd brother may not be able to control him. It doesn't matter how many disputes we have within our Imperial clan. That's our personal matter. But how we can let other people interfere in it? The second prince continued. What do you mean by that, second brother? The third prince asked. To be continued. Chapter 5:15. Yi Shiwen obviously didn't know what the second prince and the third prince were planning. He was only looking at the Imperial clan's old consecrate who was in front of him. However, that old consecrate of the Imperial clan was also looking back at him in an attempt to evaluate him. Unexpectedly, the old consecrate didn't attack Yi Shiwen anymore. He had also seen that Yi Zaiwen's movement was extremely quick. Yi Shiwen wasn't a match for him. However, it wouldn't be easy for him to kill Yi Shiwen either. In fact, there was also the chance of Yi Shiwen making a counterattack. Moreover, he would only weaken his team's strength if he attacked Yi Shiwen right now. A lot of forces might arrive here because of the appearance of the bereaved. A portion of the meteor sect had already arrived here, and nobody knew how many forces could arrive later. Therefore, killing Yi Shiwen would only weaken the great Weiss Imperial strength at this time. It seemed that everyone had forgotten about the death of the 7th prince. Even that Imperial clan's old consecrate didn't care about his death. And he didn't take any punitive measures against Yi Shiwen either. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but admire the heartlessness of the Imperial clan. You are valuable only when you're alive. You would be of no use if you've died. Nobody would speak for you. Nobody would stand by your side. The people of the Imperial clan hurriedly rushed inside the heavenly pit after watching these scenes. Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon were behind these people. They were obviously witnessing the so-called division of so-called relatives and strangers, close ones and unknowns. And these two individuals were undoubtedly the strangers. These two didn't wish to become cannon fodder for the Imperial clan, especially the Wood Dragon. He was very ambitious to the extent that he was eager to get control over the 23rd prince and make him his puppet. How he could voluntarily become cannon fodder for someone else. Everyone saw countless heavenly treasures all over the place as soon as they arrived in the underground world. Moreover, there were many of the precious herbs which had already vanished from the outside world several thousand years ago. This place is an ancient world. It may have been isolated from the outside world several thousand years ago. Therefore, many of these herbs can't be found in the outside world. Yi Shiwen swept his glance over those heavenly treasures and said, he knew many pill-making methods. However, he could only use a few of them because many of the raw materials required for those pill-making methods were such heavenly treasures that had already extinguished many years ago. Therefore, it was useless to have the pill-making methods without the necessary raw materials. Yi Xuan must think of a method to replace those drug ingredients that were required for these pill-making methods if he wanted to walk on the road of alchemy. And this was a humongous task. However, Yi Xuan found several drug ingredients that were required for many pill-making methods he knew with a cursory glance. Now, everyone will separately look for the whereabouts of the bereaved. You must know that this matter is related to the ownership of the throne of our great Wei state. I won't say much. You do your best. The old consecrate had barely finished speaking when he transformed into a streamer and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Yi Xuan, doesn't it seem that this old consecrate is the real main force sent by that old geezer of a martial emperor of Wei state to look for the bereaved? The wood dragon said. Yi Xuan nodded. This was quite possible. After all, it was useless to depend upon these princes. They were weak and also had limited influence. However, this old consecrate could accomplish the task. And these princes might only be an element to attract attentions of others. In fact, this was a very strong possibility. However, Yi Zaiwen's vision was wandering on the present scene. The atmosphere at this place had gradually begun to become intense. There was a state of mutual hostility, since there was no controlling factor on these people after the departure of that old consecrate. So, the princes and their subordinate forces had begun to tense up. The wood dragon had considered taking advantage of this opportunity to kill these people, and then he would have put the blame on those unknown ancient demon beasts that were present in this uncharted underground world. Even the wood dragon had thought along these lines. So, what could one say for these crafty princes? Therefore, it would be better if they began to explore instead of believing each other at first. Then, they could at least continue to pretend that they were working in cooperation. However, everyone was each other's enemy because this task was entirely related to the ownership of the throne. So, how they could be working in cooperation? The princes had quickly parted their ways after the departure of the old consecrate. They had trod on the rainbow lights and had disappeared from there. They didn't want to stay any longer. Soon, only Yi Xuan and Wood Dragon were left. Both individuals quickly collected these precious herbs that were present before their eyes and put them in their pouch. However, they hadn't even examined the surroundings thoroughly when they sensed that a spooky monster was arriving. The head of this monster was like that of a tiger's, and its lower body had a tail like that of a snake's. It was a kind of ancient demon beast. Yi Xuan saw it, but ignored it still. But that didn't stop that demon beast from approaching them. Yi Xuan knew that it was powerful. It was an ancient demon beast, which was at the intermediate stage of the sage realm. They had arrived here a moment ago. However, they had already met a sage realm ancient demon beast. It wasn't surprising why those people couldn't dare to come inside. This place was like a hell where sage realm beasts were running amok. That tiger-head monster rushed towards Yi Xuan to rip him apart with its claws. The entire space boiled up like a boiler and exploded loudly. Yi Xuan shot his palm in reply. The fire cloud's falling sky hand suddenly attacked that tiger-head monster and grabbed it. The tiger-head monster still looked very tyrannical even though Yi Xuan had grabbed it. It was unceasingly roaring and howling. It tried to attack Yi Zaiwen's big hand with all its might. Bang! Yi Xuan slapped the tiger-head monster and it exploded. Then its essence, blood, and demon core were absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Be careful. The monsters at this place are more tyrannical than the ones outside. This monster was only at the intermediate stage of the sage realm. However, its fighting strength was perhaps more than that of some weak experts of the late stage of the sage realm. Yi Xuan immediately judged the fighting strength of the tiger-head monster. It deserved to be called as an ancient demon beast. After all, it was far more tyrannical than the present time's demon beasts. The wood dragon nodded in fear. The tiger-head monster's fighting strength was perhaps not less than his. Yi Zaiwen's attack was powerful. However, the wood dragon would have had to go through a long battle before he could have killed this monster if he were to be in Yi Zaiwen's place. This place was far more dangerous than what he had imagined. I just saw a matrix formation placed at the entrance on our way here. I think it must have been laid down to seal this world. And that seal might have remained intact for countless years if that meteorite hadn't crashed and broken it. Yi Shiwen said they had arrived in the ancient world and had seen that a huge meteor was lying at the bottom of the heavenly pit. This meteor had broken the matrix formation that had sealed this world in one nick, and many of the ancient demon beasts had come out because of that. Someone is coming. Yi Shiwen suddenly opened his mouth and said. Both individuals promptly hid behind a broken rock. They held their breaths and hid their presence. Two black lights came streaking down from the sky a moment later and burst into the heavenly pit. Yi Shiwen was still thinking who could have dared to come down here. After all, the meteor sect had already arrived, and only the Great Wei Empire's imperial clan had interest in this place, apart from them, and their people had also arrived here. Other people were basically spectators. He heard the voice of the wood dragon. Yi Shiwen, those people belong to the Southern Dipper. Wood Dragon's voice startled Yi Shiwen. He looked at those two black lights with full concentration. He saw two experts dressed in black robes inside the group of black fog. However, he couldn't see their appearance. The Southern Dipper. This was the first time Yi Shiwen had seen the members of the Southern Dipper. Moreover, they looked like the official members from their clothing. The so-called Northern Dipper's lord was alive, but the Southern Dipper's lord had died. Therefore, the Northern Dipper's moon-white uniform was different from the Southern Dipper's. And this was the reason why their members used to roam in black robes and carry a bit of ice-cold and deathly stillness. The Northern Dipper and the Southern Dipper had a several-years-old enmity. Nobody could clearly tell how the conflict had aroused at that time. It seemed as if they had begun to oppose each other a long time ago. If the Northern Dipper genuinely had a sworn enemy, then it was certainly the Southern Dipper. And their working style was also entirely different from that of the Northern Dippers. Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon were properly hidden, so those two members of the Southern Dipper couldn't see them. Therefore, they directly entered the depths of the heavenly pit. This is going to be fun. The people of the Southern Dipper have obtained the news and have arrived here. Moreover, it seems that they are the newbies of the Southern Dipper. This is going to be the first time I am going to be exchanging blows with the new generation members of the Southern Dipper. The Wood Dragon spoke up in excitement. He was a top heavens pride expert. A very few experts of his generation had reached this stage if the experts of the older generations were excluded. And he had already excluded Yi Shiwen from the list as well. After all, Yi Shiwen wasn't a human, he was simply a monster. Moreover, the most talented experts of his generation belonged to the Northern Dipper and the Southern Dipper. Unfortunately, both organizations were sworn enemies. Therefore, the members of both sides never let go off their enemies whenever they met. Those two individuals looked like official members. However, they didn't seem to have the strength of the Great Sage Realm. So, they obviously weren't old members. They must be the newcomers, just like Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon. Hee, let's wipe them out. We will certainly get rewards for it. In fact, there must be a significant reward for killing even one of their members. The Wood Dragon was mostly excited because of this reason. How it can be so easy. I think you can't even handle one of them. Yi Shiwen pointed out. He hadn't looked down upon the Wood Dragon. In fact, the Wood Dragon was truly strong. He could become a super expert in the future if given enough time to grow. Yi Shiwen had only glanced at those members of the Southern Dipper. However, he had caught on to the auras that were being emitted from their bodies. They didn't have less strength than the Wood Dragon. In fact, One among those two members had given him a palpitating feeling. "Of course, I certainly can't. However, that doesn't mean you can't. They may be abnormal. But aren't you one as well?" The wood dragon casually countered his point. A blue vein stuck out on Yi Zaiwen's forehead. He desperately wanted to raise his foot and kick the wood dragon. His words had obviously come out as praise. However, Yi Shiwen had noticed what was wrong with this praise. How could he not have noticed the mockery in it? However, the experts of the meteor sect had already arrived earlier in large numbers. Then, the members of the Southern Dipper had appeared. Moreover, it wasn't clear who else would arrive later. Even the imperial clan of the Great Way State wasn't their close friend either. To be continued. Chapter 516. Presently, they were in a situation where they were surrounded by enemies from all sides. Therefore, they must be careful in all aspects. They must advance gradually and must fortify themselves at every step. They couldn't afford to relax even a bit. Yi Shiwen and the wood dragon didn't stay there any longer. They forged ahead, since it wasn't clear who might arrive the next moment. They went ahead and discovered that ancient demon beasts were present everywhere. This was probably so because this ancient world had been isolated from the outside world since a long time. Corpses could be seen everywhere along the way they were headed in. Groups after groups of ancient demon beasts had been wiped out along the way. This must be the work of the people of the meteor sect, Yi Shiwen speculated. He also knew a bit about the working methods of the meteor sect. After all, that blood-red-clothed young master was a member of the meteor sect. In fact, he was a young lord of the meteor sect. These people had wiped out the ancient demon beasts rather quickly. They had crushed the demon beast tribes one by one. They had also taken away the demon cores, skins, and other valuable stuff. In fact, they hadn't left anything behind. Flutter, flutter! They came across a group of white snakes in the sky. They were surprised to see that each of these snakes was covered by fine snow-white scales from head to toe that were suffused with rays of light. There was a pair of long snow-white wings at the back of these snakes, and it was exceptionally beautiful to look at. However, each of those snakes opened their mouth wide like a sacrificial bowl and rushed towards both of them. Each of them was approximately 4 to 5 meters long. These are flying snakes. Yi Shiwen recognized these white snakes. These were the ancient demon beasts that were mentioned in the ancient books. These so-called flying snakes were like the ones mentioned in the ancient legends. They didn't have feet, but they could fly since a pair of wings had grown on their ribs. Moreover, they excelled at puffing out smoke. So, they were similar to dragons in a way. These flying snakes had flourished in the ancient times. In fact, it was said that they were created by a great god, and they were pets of that god. However, there were only legends. In fact, the flying snakes had almost vanished from the world, and were quite rare as a result. Yi Shiwen had seen the records of these flying snakes in some ancient books. However, he hadn't expected that he would bump into these flying snakes right after he would arrive here. Damn it! These are strange and ancient beasts. The past of this ancient world seems very remote. The wood dragon was left dumbstruck. Those ancient demon beasts were ancient enough to be called ancient creatures. However, these flying snakes could be considered as old ancestors of those ancient demon beasts. They were extremely old creatures. These strange beasts used to be very famous in the remote past. These flying snakes had formed overwhelming layers of white clouds in the sky. In fact, even the demon beasts didn't dare to stop the flying snakes. These flying snakes saw Yi Shiwen. They considered him as a prey and rushed towards him in overwhelming numbers. The expressions in the eyes of the wood dragon also looked firm. He knew that he couldn't dare to relax. These flying snakes were very powerful. They deserved to be called as ancient creatures. Most of them were sage realm beasts, and there were no less than thousands of flying snakes in this flock. They could easily pose a deadly threat for both individuals. The so-called a group of ants can also bite an elephant to death. There were many among them that were at the late stage of the Sage Realm. Moreover, there were several strong monsters that were at the peak of the Sage Realm. Clang! The wood dragon attacked first. His energy soared up and enveloped the surroundings. It strongly shook all directions, and an astonishing blade energy swept out to chop its targets. Poochie! Several flying snakes that were flying cheerfully were cut into two halves. You audacious mortal! Seems won't surrender without a fight. A loud shout came from the group of these flying snakes. Each of these flying snakes was moving in a sequence that resembled a marching battle formation. These flying snakes had already become mythical spirits with intelligence. In fact, people would have also believed that an army was marching if the appearance of each of these flying snakes were to be replaced by humans. Moreover, many tyrannical and profound auras were hidden among these flying snakes. Even some looming auras of great sage realm could also be sensed among them. These auras belonged to the intrepid snakes of the half-step great sage realm. Poochie! Yi Zywin's fire clouds falling sky hand grabbed several flying snakes and exploded them. The flesh and blood of a sage realm flying snake was very useful for cultivation. So, Yi Shiwen threw their entire bodies in the heavenly source mirror and let Yi Mo absorb them. However, he didn't dare to delay any further. He prompted Wood Dragon, "Hurry, let's get out of here." The Wood Dragon didn't dare to delay either, and he promptly followed Yi Shiwen and flew away. His voice hadn't even faded when a big hand suddenly swept down, and it smashed on the spot where these two individuals had been standing a moment ago. These flying snakes have genuinely become mythical spirits. The Wood Dragon looked horrified. These flying snakes looked like snakes. However, how could those dumb demon beasts be a match for them? They weren't on the same level. Basically, the more tyrannical the demon beasts were on an innate level, the more difficult it was for them to transform their appearances. The ordinary demon beasts of Truth Realm could transform their appearances very easily. However, those demon beasts were insignificant in comparison to demon beasts like these flying snakes. The flying snakes were ancient demon beasts. Moreover, they possessed a very high-level bloodline in their bodies. So, they were naturally very outstanding. However, one would be gravely mistaken to treat them as ordinary beasts, even though they couldn't transform their appearances. "Run!" Yi Shiwen shouted. Neither of the two individuals dared to delay. However, those flying snakes were getting closer and closer behind them. These flying snakes excelled at puffing out smoke. They didn't have feet, but they could fly. So, each of these flying snakes had transformed into a silver light and were chasing after them. The golden divinities suddenly condensed into a pair of wings on Yi Zywin's back. He held the wood dragon and instantly covered a distance of more than a kilometer. Those flying snakes suddenly found themselves lagging far behind since he had opened up a huge gap in an instant. Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden streamer under several flapping of wings and disappeared before the eyes of those flying snakes. The sounds of the loud roars of those flying snakes' ancestors echoed from behind them. "This is basically a shortened version of the ancient era," the wood dragon spoke up in a horrified tone. He had almost been eaten up by those flying snakes a moment ago. He might not have escaped from those flying snakes if Yi Shiwen hadn't carried him and escaped. Both of them rushed into the depths of the ancient world after they had reorganized a bit, and both of them had become extremely careful because of their recent experience. Time was passing steadily. In fact, 2 months' time had passed in a wink. Both of them were wandering inside this world, seeking the whereabouts of the bereaved. They weren't looking for the information of bereaved just because of the Great Way State. After all, the Northern Dipper had also asked them to find the information of the bereaved once they had heard the news. Moreover, it was said that they might still send another senior expert to coordinate with these two individuals in finding the information. More forces had arrived at this place in the past 2 months. Even some of the deeply hidden sects of the secret world had also sent their experts. A rumor had gradually begun to circulate between those forces that had arrived. It was being said that this ancient world was actually the base station of a bereaved clan from the past, and that bereaved clan had left behind heavy treasures inside this base. This rumor had obviously made these forces excited. Moreover, it had attracted more and more experts. Someone had even said that they had seen great sage realm experts, since they had also been attracted by this news. One must know that they were known as the bereaved race. However, the bereaved race was also divided into many different tribal groups at that time. So, they weren't the same tribal group at large. One could say that their various groups were different from each other, just as it was for the human race. It was said that this place was the ruins of a large bereaved clan. Therefore, it might have precious treasures of the bereaved race. There was a big difference between the divine tools of the bereaved and those of the human race. However, these exotic treasures were undoubtedly enough to attract a lot of experts. This rumor had made even more noise after the discovery of a palace's remnants by some people. Consequently, everyone had spread the rumor that a big ruin might have been discovered. Initially, the rumor that the bereaved had arrived here had attracted the experts of the younger generation. However, the older generation experts of some secret worlds had also begun to appear along with emergence of these rumors. It has been confirmed by an expert of the older generation that there is a ruin here, and it may genuinely be the ruins of the bereaved clan. There may be some precious treasures as well. I don't know who will be able to get their hands on these treasures. Don't look at this as an opportunity, since it might be an enormous disaster instead. After all, would it be good to provoke those bereaved? So much chaos had occurred in the past because of them. Who will be able to escape from the hands of these bereaved? Someone felt that this wasn't an opportunity. In fact, it could be a huge disaster. A bloodbath might take place if the bereaved were genuinely present there. How many people wanted to plunder the treasure of the bereaved? However, how many people would genuinely be able to achieve it? Those ancient demon beasts must be the spirit beasts that have been captured and confined here as guards in case those bereaved people are genuinely present here. Many of the legends label the bereaved race as barbarous and uncultured. However, one must admit the fact that those bereaved have also developed their own culture. I think the Meteor sect has the accurate information because the majority of the bereaved in the Meteor world had been suppressed by them. Maybe these ruins were sealed by them only. It's difficult to say, but they may have some information. This was the most widely circulated rumor. Many people had believed that the Meteor sect had the information of these ruins in their hands. Didn't everyone see that those people of the Meteor sect had arrived here first? Therefore, it might be possible that they had obtained some information and had then arrived here so quickly. Yeah, it seems that the people of the Meteor sect may have the most accurate information, if any exists in the first place. However, who will dare to follow them? A few people had tried to follow them without causing annoyance, but they were killed as a result. Some people had also believed that they could rely on their own strength to force information out of the people of the Meteor sect, but they had gotten slaughtered in the end. In fact, not a single such person had managed to survive. Various kinds of rumors had begun to make rounds, and this had made it difficult for many people to differentiate between the true information and the false ones. Every person had their own version of the events. However, most people still believed that this place had the vestige of the bereaved. The Meteor sect's small Jupiter is too vicious and merciless. More than 100 people have been killed by him, and the majority of those people were sage experts. He is known as Small Jupiter because he is too fierce at heart. Who would dare to act rashly before the Jupiter? To be continued. Chapter 517. News had transmitted after 2 months that a great sage expert had gone inside the depths of the heavenly crater. Apparently, he had found some clues and was searching because of it. This had incited everyone even further. and more experts had arrived there and joined in the search. Yi Shiwen was straddling in a group of ancient demon beasts in a valley, and he was slaughtering them left and right. He appeared like a swaying catkin while doing so. He was facing a group of ancient mountain beasts draped in golden scales. Their bodies were extremely hard. They were roaring loudly. They all possessed earth-type magical power, and they had been unleashing this power upon Yi Shiwen. A massive rock fell from the sky, and it seemed that it would crush Yi Shiwen to death. Many of these ancient demon beasts were at the late stage of the semi-sage realm, but the majority of them were at the sage realm. Yi Shiwen looked like a swaying catkin among them. He had an iron sword in his hand. He was brandishing his iron sword like a dragon. He was relentless, and nothing could stop him. That falling rock hadn't even reached above his head when it was broken down by his sword light. It couldn't even get close to him. However, each of these ancient demon beasts possessed spiritual intelligence. Moreover, they seemed trained just like professional soldiers. The rocks fell down from the sky in quick succession. In fact, they weren't even giving Yi Shiwen any time to catch his breath. There was an ancient tree behind Yi Shiwen. It was partially visible within a layer of golden energy that was fluctuating behind him. Of course, it was the Enlightening Mind ancient tree. The Enlightening Mind ancient tree had shrouded Yi Zaiwen's body in its entirety. The bright look in his eyes glittered with clear-mindedness. There was no trace of impurity in it. This unclouded expression in his eyes under the Enlightening Mind ancient tree was simply unprecedented. Yi Shiwen was launching attacks with a clear mind. Every sword attack was simple, just as the ones that were mentioned in the standard textbooks. He wasn't unleashing any gorgeous sword moves. However, even such ordinary sword strikes had stopped those falling rocks from approaching him. Yi Shiwen had found out that his moves had become smooth, ferocious, greatly efficiency, and very machine-like whenever he was shrouded by the Enlightening Mind ancient tree. His might had also increased very significantly. He had concealed the Enlightening Mind ancient tree inside his vital energies, and it was further covered by the dreadful divinities. So, an average person couldn't see the trace of the Enlightening Mind ancient tree. These ancient demon beasts were his test objects. His iron sword suddenly issued a clang sound. It was just an ordinary iron sword. However, it looked like a legendary sword in his hands. In fact, it seemed that this sword could even cleave the heaven when he held it. Rumble. The sounds of explosions resounded unceasingly. Yi Zaiwen's long sword was issuing endless sword lights in the sky, and those falling rocks were being shattered into pieces at a very fast speed. Buried person's sword and buried sword secrets were being displayed regularly. They had already reached a superb condition. Yi Shiwen strode on by taking the advantage of a gap he had just created, and his figure suddenly rushed out and stormed into that group of ancient demon beasts. Clang! Yi Shiwen brandished his iron sword. The sword light formed an ice-cold black light. Then it shot out several sword strikes in an instant. The bodies of those ancient mountain beasts were incredibly hard since they were draped in armors. It was difficult to injure them, even with a divine weapon. However, they were nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's iron sword. Blood splashed out wherever the sword light fell. The beasts appeared to be made up of paper as they got ravaged by those iron sword strikes. Moreover, those sword attacks had accurately struck the vital points of these demon beasts. Each of these demon beasts was more 3 meters tall. They were even taller than Yi Shiwen. However, how they could be a match for him? He shuttled among those demon beasts as if he was strolling in a courtyard. Those mountain beasts roared and collapsed one after another wherever he went. They were no match for him. Hundreds of beasts had been killed by him within the blink of an eye. He looked like the god of death for a moment because he was causing deaths wherever he was going. These demon beasts weren't weak. However, they were being slaughtered by Yi Zaiwen's sword moves because he was extremely powerful. Each move was precise to an incredible degree. His attacks was even more formidable than before. In fact, Yi Shiwen felt that his inner realm had just made a breakthrough and had entered another realm. He had previously walked on a road that had required great skills, but not much labor. His every sword attack used to have crushing power. It could crush anyone who stood in its front. This was the so-called lifting heavy weight as if it's light. A small mountain appeared as light as a feather in his hands. He could crush it while laughing and talking. However, it was different now. His sword play looked even more ordinary, but its power hadn't dropped even a bit. Even a mountain beast of Peak Sage realm couldn't stop one move of his. He didn't even need to use another move, and could kill the demon beast on the spot in one move alone. Perhaps this should be called lifting lightweight as if heavy instead of the other way around. He could crush many enemies even if he had a large feather in his hand. This was a new realm in its own. It seemed as if he had suddenly attained enlightenment. He had reached an entirely different realm altogether. The inner realm and the realm of strength were entirely different things on the path of martial arts. One couldn't turn back once they had attained a high realm of strength and gotten stronger. However, inner realm of martial arts was completely different from this. One could enter another realm only if they had comprehended the previous one thoroughly. Otherwise, one might return to the previous realm of lifting heavy weight as if it's light at any time. He still needed to practice a lot to strengthen his new realm under the lifting lightweight as if it's heavy situation. And he would be able to freely switch things around when he would get a complete hold of both lifting heavy weight as if it's light and lifting lightweight as if it's heavy realms. This was the so-called degree of control of one's mind, because the mind would interpret something heavy as light as a feather in one moment and something light as a giant mountain in the other. It was truly a confusing and complicated concept. However, Yi Shiwen had already entered this realm now, so his frame of mind had become very clear. Moreover, he clearly knew that this had happened with the support of the enlightening mind ancient tree. It wasn't surprising that many people had fought over the enlightening mind ancient tree since the ancient times. He only had a branch of the enlightening mind ancient tree. It had surely begun to grow back, but it wasn't clear how long it would take for the entire tree to grow up. One could advance by leaps and bounds if one could meditate under a complete enlightening mind ancient tree even for a day. In fact, one could make skyrocketing progress at that time. However, it wasn't clear how much he would have grown up by the time the enlightening mind ancient tree would grow back to its stage of maturity. A scarlet mirror flew out of Yi Zaiwen's body, and those demon beasts that had been killed by him were immediately absorbed by the heavenly source mirror wherever the scarlet light went. Clang! 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 The iron sword issued clang sounds. Yi Shiwen freely brandished his sword in quick succession, and the attacks unleashed unimaginable power. A large number of demon beasts were killed again, and their flesh was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror wherever the sword light went. This would obviously be used for Yi Mo's recovery later on. Yi Mo's condition had become much better. He had also woken up once in these 2 months. However, he had landed into deep sleep quite soon after that. Yi Shiwen finally managed to kill these demon beasts after having fought them for half a day. He had also managed to produce the ideal condition of lifting lightweight as if it's heavy concept this time. He could have entered this realm without the support of the enlightening mind ancient tree. However, it would have been difficult. Moreover, it wouldn't have been a smooth process. He knew that he had reached his present limit. It didn't matter how skillful he was. He needed time to enter this realm. It was similar to the case when he had taken a lot of time to enter the lifting heavy weight as if it's light realm. Moreover, the thing that had made him the most happy was that his strength was showing signs of making a breakthrough after he had faintly started to feel the lifting light weight as if it's heavy realm. He felt that his strength would soon make the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of the sage realm. It hadn't even been half a year since he had entered the initial stage of the sage realm. However, it was no big deal for him. His accumulation was extremely profound, An ordinary person must pay attention towards consolidating their realm once they had made a breakthrough, and they also required time for doing that. However, he was different. His foundation was very strong. An ordinary person required time for consolidating their realm. However, this time could be enormously shortened in his case, just like the wood dragons. The wood dragon had just reached the late stage of the sage realm a while ago. However, he was almost about to enter the peak stage of sage realm now. It was hard to say how many adventures these heavens pride-level experts had come across, but it was evident that they had obtained many more special methods than ordinary people. Therefore, it was only obvious that they couldn't be treated as ordinary people. However, Yi Zaiwen's foundation was more profound as compared to that of the wood dragons. The wood dragon had also said that he had never seen such a profound foundation as that of Yi Zaiwen's. In fact, it could scare a person to death. However, he didn't know that this rich accumulation had been acquired back when Yi Shiwen was at half-step Legendry's realm, and it had only come to manifest to its true extent in his current foundation. He had built this unprecedented and incomparably strong foundation in order to cross the terrifying sage realm, heavenly tribulation. How could an ordinary person think to such extent? However, this wasn't the time for closed-door training because he didn't have anyone by his side for protection. The wood dragon had already left him and gone to meet the great sage expert the Northern Dipper had sent. Yi Shiwen had also gone about his own way. He would join them when the time would be right. Yi Shiwen had only dared to bring out the enlightening mind ancient tree because the wood dragon wasn't present there. Otherwise, it would have been dangerous if the wood dragon had recognized it. And Yi Shiwen couldn't dare to take this risk, not at this time at least. He and the wood dragon were partners. However, one can't tell what's going on in the other person's heart. He knew that a group of great sage experts would swarm in if the news that he had a treasure like the enlightening mind ancient tree got transmitted. Yi Shiwen went inside the lair of those mountain beasts after he had killed them. It was a cave that curved down into the ground. He also killed the remaining beasts one by one on his way. He walked for a quarter of an hour or so and arrived at the bottom of the passage. He then saw a huge cavern at the bottom. Yellow-colored spirit crystals were present all around the cave. The so-called spirit crystal was a pure natural crystal that was condensed from the spirit energies. It wasn't like the spirit stone because a spirit stone was formed after a stone had gone through eternal polishing by the spirit energies. Furthermore, it would even have to absorb the spirit energies after that. Therefore, the spirit stone contained many impurities inside. However, these spirit crystals were different. They were pure and natural crystals that were entirely condensed from the spirit energies alone. So, they were very pure in their make and could be absorbed directly. These treasures could often be found inside the caves that were formed innumerable years ago. It wasn't surprising that these mountain beasts were so powerful. After all, they had been thriving on so many spirit crystals. These spirit crystals were much purer than ordinary primary spirit dawn. In fact, one piece of spirit crystal could be exchanged for more than 100 primary spirit dawn. However, the fact is that only the experts of the Great Sage realm and above could condense primary spirit dawn, and that too up to some purity. Yi Zaiwen's initial estimate suggested that this room full of spirit crystals could approximately be exchanged for 1 billion primary spirit dawn. It could be said that he had become rich overnight. He would skyrocket in one fell swoop in case he managed to obtain so much wealth. To be continued. Chapter 5:18. Yi Shiwen waved his hand, collected these spirit crystals, and put them inside the heavenly source mirror. These spirit crystals were the protective barrier with the help of which those mountain beasts had been flourishing. However, they had fallen into Yi Zaiwen's hands now. It could be said that one spirit crystal could be exchanged for 100 primary spirit dawn. In fact, one could get an even higher number of primary spirit dawn if they exchanged it in the black market. However, he didn't wish to exchange these spirit crystals. Spirit crystals could be exchanged for primary spirit dawn with ease. However, it was difficult to exchange primary spirit dawn for the spirit crystals. Yi Shiwen must find a place to absorb these spirit crystals, and his cultivation would perhaps attain a brand new progress once that had happened. Yi Shiwen had barely emerged from the underground cave when energy fluctuations appeared in the sky, and it was accompanied by the emergence of a flying fire meteor that illuminated half of the horizon. They were the meteor sex people. Yi Shiwen immediately restrained his breath, and he operated the restraining breath technique to its capacity. His entire body sank into the subspace and got concealed therein. In fact, he didn't even set off any fluctuations in this process. His restraining breath technique had reached at a new realm once he had entered the sage realm. Consequently, even a great sage expert would find it difficult to discover him once he had concealed his presence. Of course, this was subject to the condition that he mustn't move. Therefore, he was confident that a sage expert couldn't discover his existence by any means. He didn't need to worry about being discovered unless his presence had been locked onto by the enemies. The flying fire meteor had already reached above Yi Shiwen within a few breaths. He swept out his divine sense and found a few familiar faces on that flying fire meteor. The Great Wei Empire's second prince and third prince were present along with their subordinates. He had seen them separating from each other beforehand. However, they had somehow gathered together at this time. A young man was standing at the top of the flying fire meteor. He was tall and handsome. His outstanding aura was quite threatening. He was dressed in the meteor sex standard uniform. However, he had a special air about him. The flying fire meteor came to a halt in front of the underground cave of the mountain beasts. Everyone got down from it and swept their glances over the entire place. The third prince spoke up somewhat remorsefully. "We are late. He has escaped. I didn't expect that this dragon master would be so sly. He's one slippery bastard. I think he's a poisonous snake, a viper that can bite you anywhere and any time." The second prince opened his mouth and said, in fact, he had said this as he had looked towards that young man who was standing in front of everyone and seemed like the leader of this group. "Has someone from our side leaked the news and allowed him to get away?" A prince's consecrate opened his mouth and speculated. "It's impossible. We had departed at the same time, and now we have gathered together. So he couldn't have obtained news, let alone escape in advance." The third prince denied and said they had planned to deal with Yi Shiwen from the get-go. It had seemed that they had scattered when they had departed. However, they had gathered together soon after that. Therefore, nobody here could say that the news might have gotten leaked. They had been pursuing Yi Shiwen since the last few months, and they had finally obtained the news of him being present in this vicinity with great difficulty. Therefore, they had rushed straight here. However, it seemed that Yi Shiwen hadn't left long ago. Look at this mess. It's obvious that this dragon master has left recently. Moreover, it doesn't appear like he has left in a hurry after getting the news. I can only say that this guy's luck is very good. He must have left very recently from the looks of it. So shouldn't we purse him? Someone asked. Yi Shiwen had now understood that why these experts of the Great Wei State's imperial clan had left so quickly at that time. They had been planning to deal with him. Moreover, they had also brought the experts of the meteor sect along with them. That young man's imposing aura was suppressive and threatening. He looked suave and outgoing. He had already entered the small perfection level of the sage realm. So, he was a step ahead of the peak level of the sage realm. Each martial art move of the peak level of the sage realm has a standard style as per the comparison based on the practice moves. But these different styles can be linked up together in order in the case of small perfection level of the sage realm. So there wouldn't be any gap in between the moves as a result of this linking. And this meant that there was a big power gap between the two realms. Furthermore, one could easily use these styles in an unorganized sequence once they had reached the great perfection level of the sage realm. One could disrupt the order of these moves, and one wouldn't need to adhere to the sequence of the styles. Therefore, the experts of sage great perfection realm could unleash these moves at will, and without following any order. Consequently, they could cast a move at the time of unleashing the attack, but that move could get transformed into some other move when the attack would finally get materialized. The sage small perfection realm was more incredible than the sage peak realm. In fact, these two realms were almost entirely at different levels. There's no need. He's just a small fish and nothing more. He can't stir up mighty waves in the sea, the young man said disdainfully. It was obvious that he didn't give a damn about Yi Shiwen. Many senior experts of our meteor sect have arrived. So what's he? He's nothing. You don't need to worry. Of course, you are right, Brother Xingfei Yue. That Dragon Master isn't an issue for a talented man like you. I only suspect that those two belong to some organization, and they might secretly wish to topple the rule of our meteor sect. The second prince said. He had hit the nail on the head. He had harbored doubts about the origins of Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon since the beginning. After all, he hadn't been able to find anything about the backgrounds of both these individuals. And this was the most dreadful thing for him. I will go and report this matter to the higher-ups. The sect will investigate and find the origins of both these individuals. This is our meteor sect's domain. It's ridiculous if they think that they can topple our meteor sect's rule. They think too highly of themselves if they are embracing such a notion. They are overconfident. Xingfei's face exposed a disdainful smile. His confidence had originated from the formidable strength of the meteor sect. They had been ruling the meteor world since countless years. Moreover, they hadn't declined even once, unlike the true Martial University. The meteor world was their territory. Therefore, he believed that those two were thinking too highly of themselves if they thought that they could topple their rule in their backyard. They were overreaching themselves. A mysterious light suddenly flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. The Northern Dipper's objective wasn't to topple the meteor sect's rule. The Northern Dipper had tyrannical strength. However, they had a very few personnel in their ranks. So, their combined strength was far from rivaling that of the meteor sects. Therefore, they wouldn't go for a head-on confrontation with the meteor sect by attempting to topple their rule. However, this matter was tied to planting a Northern Dipper saboteur in the meteor sect. It wasn't clear when this saboteur would prove his usefulness. After all, Yi Shiwen didn't even know how many such saboteurs the Northern Dipper commanded. However, the 23rd Prince was very important for Yi Shiwen, since this would be his first base of operation for obtaining resources from the Great Wei Empire at a steady rate. This obviously wouldn't satisfy his ever-increasing requirement of resources. However, it would still be a steady source of income for him. Therefore, the consequences would be disastrous for Yi Shiwen if he ended up attracting the attention of a sect as enormous as the meteor sect. After all, the meteor sect had been ruling the meteor world for so many years. So, they wouldn't show any mercy if someone tried to topple their rule. Therefore, he couldn't allow them to spread this news. And this meant that he would need to annihilate the sources of the news before that. That Dragon Master is only an irksome fly, nothing more. He's nothing. They aren't a match for our meteor sect. Shang Feiyue said. Yi Shiwen and his trusted aide could prove to be a big trouble for the second prince. However, they were nothing for him. He had such belief and confidence, and he also had the strength to back it up. Moreover, he was also confident that Yi Shiwen would be a mere peak-level expert of the Sage realm at most. However, he himself had already entered the Sage, small perfection realm. Therefore, he would crush Yi Shiwen to death if the latter dared to appear. This ancient world was once the headquarters of the deceased, bereaved clan. So, this place has countless precious treasures. My cultivation will advance by leaps and bounds as long as I obtain even one of these ancient treasures. Won't I be able to suppress that Dragon Master at that time as well? So, What if he is a great master of alchemy? I will crush him to death with ease. Shang Feiyue coldly said. Shang Feiyue sat down on the flying fire meteor after he said this. Then he urged to fly forward. It transformed into a grandiose streamer of light and disappeared in the horizon. Yi Shiwen came out of the void. His pupils contracted, and a cold intention flickered in his eyes. A pair of golden wings suddenly appeared on his back. He then opened his wings, transformed into a golden streamer, and chased after them at a speed that was even quicker than theirs. He didn't have a divine flying tool like the flying fire meteor. However, his devil wings were an extremely powerful magical ability in their own merit. In fact, he could even travel back and forth between myriads of worlds once it had been practiced to the pinnacle. This was the strongest aspect of the devil wings. Yi Shiwen caught up with Shang Feiyue and other people soon enough. However, he didn't act rashly and didn't alert them of his presence. Instead, he decided to hang behind them. He had restrained his breath with the help of restraining breath technique, and he was outside their line of sight. Moreover, he was using his divine sense to examine their actions. However, they couldn't discover his presence. Shang Feiyue was driving the flying fire meteor, so he was in the front. He had attracted the attentions of many demon beasts en route. However, how could those ancient demon beasts be a match for him? They had obviously been crushed by these people. Yi Shiwen was steadily pursuing them, and a blur silhouette of the enlightening mind ancient tree was present behind him. Consequently, he had never been so clear-headed. He was pursuing Shang Feiyue and the others on the one hand, and he was undergoing practice on the other. In fact, he felt that his cultivation was already at a critical juncture. He felt that he would reach the intermediate stage of the sage realm if he could make another breakthrough at this time. His fighting strength could be compared to that of an expert of the sage, small perfection realm once that had happened. And then he could blow up this arrogant Shang Feiyue with a single punch. He just needed to wait. The look in Yi Zaiwen's eyes was charged by thousands kinds of tricks. All kinds of plans and schemes had appeared in his mind, one by one. His attitude had become unprecedentedly peaceful under the effect of the enlightening mind ancient tree. His killing intention had certainly become stronger with the passage of time. However, that hadn't had the slightest of effect on his rational mind. So he could still think of all sorts of schemes in a calm manner. Time passed day by day, and it had soon been more than a month ever since Yi Shiwen had started to pursue Shang Feiyue and the others. Shang Feiyue and the others had gone on expeditions in all directions in this more than a month's time, and they had also come across dangers several times. However, they had escaped all dangers. They had also obtained many benefits during this time. They had already ventured deep into the underground world of the heavenly pit by now. They had also come across increasingly powerful ancient demon beasts as they had gone farther into the depths of this underground world. Many of those demon beasts had attained spiritual intelligence and had established their own ancient demon beast kingdoms. And that too in perfect order. Yi Shiwen had been amazed at the sight of this. Everyone had arrived in front of a huge mountain at this time. There's something wrong about this huge mountain. I think it's a massive ancient demon beast. To be continued. Chapter 519. Everyone was surprised to see this gigantic mountain when they arrived in front of it. They noticed that it was a mountain range that had stretched up to more than 1,000 kilometers. In fact, it was so huge that they couldn't see its boundary. There's something wrong about this huge mountain. Wait, this is a huge ancient beast. The second prince exclaimed on top of the flying fire meteor. He had realized that this wasn't a huge mountain. Instead, it was the corpse of an incomparably huge ancient demon beast. The corpse of this ancient demon beast had gotten covered with layers of dusts with the passage of time. Thus, it had eventually formed such a huge sierra. It was covered with layers of dusts and had passed through countless years of transformation. However, Everyone quickly found out that this was a beast's corpse once they calmed down. They swept their divine senses through the layers of dusts and saw that there was a gigantic beast under that cover of earth. Its entire body was covered with ice-cold black scales. Moreover, it seemed as if molten iron had poured out from its body and had then submerged into the dust. And so, that huge body had taken the form of an endless mountain range. Many ancient demon beasts were living on top of that mountain. They were surviving with the support of this giant creature's corpse. Moreover, its blood essence had already condensed into crystal stones. It's such a giant creature. It shouldn't be in hibernation, right? The third prince asked skeptically. He had swept out his divine sense. However, he could still feel its looming coercion. Moreover, its corpse didn't seem to have decayed. In fact, it still looked vivid and alive. His entire body stretched tightly. He was afraid that the awakening of this giant creature would lead to a terrible battle. One must know that this wasn't his assumption. Instead, it was possibly a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, it wasn't impossible by any means. These mega-sized creatures were different from the human race. After all, the human race had a short lifespan. However, some inborn giant creatures were similar to dragon race and so on. They had a lifespan of several thousand years. And such great lifespans meant that their life was simply endless. They could live for way too long before they died. They possessed outstanding innate talent and noble bloodline. So they could reach to a very profound realm during the innumerable years of their lives, even if they didn't practice. On the contrary, the human race had to work hard and cultivate with their entire strength in order to obtain a very long lifespan. One could even say that these giant creatures were the true heaven's favored ones. Sleeping was a very good way to kill endless time. The human race had to strive to cultivate in order to reach to a particular realm. However, these creatures could automatically arrive at that realm by taking a nap. Anyone would become incomparably jealous by looking at such natural talent. This could also be the case with this colossus. After all, it might have become a mountain range after being in hibernation for thousands of years. Therefore, it would be a dreadful disaster if this giant creature was to be woken up. He's already dead. Sheng Feiyue concluded. He had relaxed after he had confirmed that this colossus was dead. After all, he had also been afraid of what could have happened if this creature was suddenly awakened. There's a huge, empty wound on its head. Everyone looked in the direction in which Shang Feiyue had pointed his finger. Everyone then saw a huge hole at the peak of this huge mountain range. Streams of red water were splashing out of it from time to time. Everyone held their breath. It wasn't clear when this colossus had died. However, it was still bleeding. Moreover, it didn't seem like its body had decayed. So, it was evident that this colossus must have been very powerful. However, the thing that had alarmed him even more was the fact that such a formidable colossus had been killed by someone in one stroke. He could guess that this colossus hadn't even been able to fight back. Therefore, it was possible that it may have died in one shot. Moreover, there weren't any traces of superficial scars on its body either. That person must have been insanely powerful. This is a star colossus. Yi Shiwen had recognized it in a second. There was a faintly looming star power around it. So, it was obviously a star colossus. What else could it have been? Most importantly, it hailed from the tribe of that star colossus that was sealed inside his heavenly source mirror. Star colossuses had many tribes. It wasn't that they were a single race. However, they usually kept to themselves. They would rarely come together. Yi Shiwen entered the heavenly source mirror as he realized this. That star colossus had already become motionless in the blood pool. After all, it wasn't its real body, it was only a wisp of its soul. Therefore, there was no power left inside it, since Yi Shiwen had unceasingly been extracting its power. Yi Zaiwen's blood slave was quietly waiting on the other side. This blood slave had unconsciously made the breakthrough to the peak of the sage realm. The power that had been extracted from the body of the star colossus had been entirely absorbed by the blood slave. Therefore, the blood slave had promoted at a brisk pace, while the star colossus had become more and more dispirited. This star colossus was at half-step Great Sage Realm. However, it still didn't have any way while facing the unending extraction of its vitality. It hadn't anticipated that it would fall into Yi Zaiwen's hand when it was plotting against him. After all, Yi Shiwen hadn't even reached the semi-sage realm at that time. In fact, he had merely been at the half-step legendary realm. Yi Shiwen would have a half-step Great Sage Realm helper by his side by the time this star colossus' entire vitality was absorbed by the blood slave, and nobody below the Great Sage Realm would be able to deal with him when that happens. Yi Shiwen, you'll die a dog's death! The star colossus roared as soon as Yi Shiwen came inside. But he had long been weak. The chains of the talisman that had shackled his body were still absorbing his vitality. Die miserably? Why you would have been in this situation if you hadn't plotted against me. Yi Shiwen smirked. He had anticipated that he had no way to destroy the magic seed inside his body because of this star colossus. He had surely put his entire effort into suppressing it. However, the magic seed was still gradually maturing, and it could pose a huge threat to him one day. In fact, it wouldn't be pretty if he were to die under the influence of the magic seed. Practicing Heart Seed Devil Method was like dying 10 times without getting birth again. It was a method used for controlling other people. Yi Shiwen had that magic seed planted inside his body, and he had been surviving it so far. However, it was like a sharp sword that was hanging above his head, and it could fall at any time. In fact, it wasn't even known when it would fall. However, it would certainly be a dead end if it fell. He could only improve his cultivation in order to suppress the growth of the magic seed. He would get an opportunity to live on if this magic seed broke. Moreover, his martial power would increase drastically if that were to happen. However, he would die miserably if he couldn't survive it. However, he didn't have any other choice at this time. That thing lying over there should be from your race. Yi Shiwen loosened the star colossus seal so that it could see outside. How's this possible? The star colossus couldn't believe its eyes. However, it hadn't mistaken that familiar aura. They were similar star colossuses. However, they hadn't met frequently. In fact, they might not have seen anyone of their race in their entire lifetime. However, that wound was even more frightening. It seemed as if someone had attacked from the sky with a spear and had nailed it to death. It was hard to express in words how ferocious the killer would have been. Ha ha ha! God is really helping me. The corpse of such a colossus is infinitely precious. Ha ha ha! It seems that God has destined me, Shangfeiwa, to rise to the peak. Shangfei's eyes suddenly glittered as he glanced over it. He wouldn't have dared to provoke a living colossus. However, a dead one couldn't pose any threat to him. On the contrary, it was a huge treasure for him. Shangfeiwa immediately drove the flying fire meteor down. However, several hundred giant apes suddenly jumped out from the endless forest that was on that mountain range before they could land on it. Their entire bodies were emitting silver rays of light, and their faces looked fierce. Many exceptionally vicious Sage Realm apes were also present among these huge apes. Most of them had already arrived in front of these people and had launched attacks with their fists. Moreover, their fist technique looked smooth. In fact, their fists even issued whistling sounds. These giant apes have already become sentient. Their fist technique is so smooth and relaxed. It isn't inferior to that of the great masters of human race who have been immersed in practicing fist techniques for many years. Yi Shiwen remarked, "Where have they learnt this from? Is it their innate magical skill?" Martial arts cultivators used to focus on a particular martial heritage. Those who didn't have any dedicated heritage were called random cultivators with no background. People often wouldn't pay attention to such people because it was quite difficult to become powerful if one didn't have a heritage. However, Where had these silver giant apes learnt this fist technique from? Is it because they are related to the bloodline of this star colossus? Yi Shiwen secretly guessed. The demon beasts on this mountain were perhaps born with the bloodline of this star colossus. They were visibly different from the ordinary demon beasts. In fact, this case was similar to how the star beasts in the foreign battlefield had taken birth with the bloodline of that sealed star colossus. These giant apes rushed forward. Consecrates of a few princes didn't even get the time to react, and were killed by the fist attacks of the giant apes. Audacious evil beasts! Xing Feiyue finally moved into action. His entire energy soared into the sky. He didn't say anything else as he stretched out a big hand. A blue light suddenly spread across the entire sky, and the blue light that had emitted from his palm formed a huge net in the sky. The swift giant apes that were approaching a fast speed bumped into that huge net and got pierced by the blue lights. They screamed and fell down from the sky. Xing Feiyue had displayed the true might of the sage, small perfection realm. A silver giant ape suddenly roared at this time. It came out flying from inside the mountain. This silver giant ape was nearly twice as tall as the other giant apes. It launched a long-range raid. It seemed as if a small mountain was rolling over with loud bangs. Many stars were revolving around it. They were a representation of its star power. Its imposing aura was earth-shattering. After all, it was a demon beast of sage, small perfection realm. It was the leader of these silver giant apes, and it was very powerful. This leader of the silver giant apes suddenly roared loudly, and the noise shook the sky. The silver star power on its body looked incredible. It issued tyrannical aura as its fist swept out toward Xing Feiyue. In fact, the sounds of its bellows were similar to that of a devil god. The space was shattered into pieces by the fist's pressure. Rumble! Xing Feiyue clashed with the leader of silver giant apes, and the result was earth-shattering. The remaining experts of the Great Wei Empire also began to fight with those other silver giant apes. Now is my chance! Yi Zaiwen's eyes lit up. He fluttered his golden wings. He took a detour towards the back of the mountain and landed there. To be continued. Chapter 5:20. The front side of this mountain range had already been damaged very severely. However, these cracks on the mountain range were only constricted to the range of a dozen kilometers. They hadn't continued to proliferate any further. In fact, it seemed that a mysterious force was constricting the cracks from proliferating. This was the work of the principle of this star colossus. That had automatically protected its body. This incredible star colossus still possessed amazing power, even though it had been dead for countless years. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze. There weren't any other creatures present on top of this mountain. Only the star beasts that had born with the bloodline of this star colossus were present on the mountain. Other ancient demon beasts couldn't come near this mountain. They had been repelled by that inexplicable coercion. Yi Shiwen had barely approached the mountain range when he felt an overwhelming suppressive force pressing down upon him. His golden divinities automatically covered his entire body as a result, and resisted that huge suppressive force. Yi Shiwen walked on the mountain and arrived at that huge wound. Small pools of blood were flowing inside the wound at all times. Yi Shiwen jumped inside the wound. This was an extremely long passage. He could even feel that this star, colossus body still had the vitality. It didn't seem that it had died several years ago. Its ferocious body would have made it extremely difficult to kill it if its mind hadn't been extinguished by that strike. Its blood still contained huge amounts of energy. It wasn't surprising that those silver giant apes possessed extraordinary strength. Yi Shiwen went ahead, walking along that huge wound. He could still hear the thumping heartbeats that were transmitting the blood in all parts of its body. Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden streamer and flew inside the body of the star colossus. He saw a planet inside its body some time later. It was revolving, and a section of universe had taken shape around it. This was a piece of universe. This star colossus had actually quenched a planet inside its inner core, and it had used the star power from that planet as the driving force for its own body. No wonder that these star colossuses were so powerful that it was hard to find a match for them. The true Marshall University had been compelled to collapse by a star colossus in its most prosperous times. However, this star colossus vitality hadn't gone down after its death. That's because its soul had been annihilated, but the star core was still preserved. Therefore, this huge body hadn't decayed since it had been supported by a steady stream of star power. After all, this star colossus wasn't immortal in reality. Its body had only appeared immortal for countless years because of this nucleus that was unceasingly producing star power. It's hard to imagine the strength of the man who killed this huge monster. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to admire. This world had many people whose strength was beyond his very comprehension. However, he became excited soon after. He had always been worried about his future progress because he had started his journey late when compared to his peers. After all, that kid Pangyang Bo had become a Heaven's Pride expert and had advanced to the semi-sage realm at the age of 10 years. However, Yi Shiwen had merely entered the Hotian realm when he was 11 or 12 years old. He had surely put his entire effort to reduce this disparity in the future, and his cultivation realm had also advanced quite quickly. However, there had been a big disparity from the beginning, and he couldn't ignore this disparity anyhow. He needed to advance quicker than those other Heaven's Pride experts in order to catch up. However, this would undoubtedly make his foundation unstable. This wasn't a joke. What would be the long-term prospect of a tall building with an unstable foundation? It might collapse at any time. He knew about this matter more than anyone else since it was more important to him than it was to others. Therefore, he had always attached special importance to this matter. He had always made the preparations before he would make a breakthrough. He would obviously do this to make his foundation safer and better. However, it required the support of countless spirit energies. The realm was like the blueprint of a tall building. He could deduce it with the help of his mysterious space. However, he couldn't construct the building without the help of the raw materials. He had nearly consumed the resources he had obtained by winning the four-sex martial arts competition, and now this huge star core had fallen upon him like an enormous pie. Moreover, it was much easier to absorb it than the primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate. He promptly laid out a barrier formation inside the body of this colossus. After that, he began his closed-door training. He put his entire effort and didn't stop for even a bit. The observing person scripture was operating crazily. It didn't stop for even a moment. The small universe in his body was also revolving frantically. The star core issued buzzing sound like a spinning cocoon since its star power was being extracted little by little. It was obviously being absorbed by Yi Zaiwen's body. This endless star power was a big supplement for him. He didn't even need to convert this energy. He must obtain the support of more and more star power if he wanted to expand the universe that was inside his body. The star power gradually entered his small universe. His small universe had also begun to expand inch by inch. Yi Zaiwen's small solar system had taken shape after he had entered the Sage Realm. It could now function independently. In fact, it could even produce star power which could further expand his universe. However, its speed was very slow. In fact, forming a proper universe still looked far-fetched. He would need to draw support from this solar system for several hundred years or 1,000 years, or even more than that to make that happen. However, this star core had enormously accelerated this process. He gradually reached closer to making the breakthrough under the influence of the surging star power. He looked like a real god sitting upright in the universe and chanting sutras from ancient scriptures. He was sitting upright under the enlightening mind ancient tree. The enlightening mind ancient tree was glowing silver under the shower of the star power. It gradually drooped upon his body, and shrouded it in its entirety. A page of the ancient scripture emitted a dazzling golden beam above Yi Zaiwen's head. It seemed like this chant had existed since ancient times. Yi Shiwen knew that time was running out. Xing Feiyue might defeat those star beasts any time, and then he would rush inside as well. Therefore, Yi Shiwen needed make the breakthrough before Xing Feiyue arrived here. Else, he would have no other choice but to escape in distress. He had decided to use all his methods in order to make the breakthrough within a short time. He had taken out the enlightening mind ancient tree, and had also used that page of the ancient God scripture along with it. This page of ancient God scripture wasn't some incredible secret method or anything. However, it was like the most profound recorded principle in the world. He would gain some benefits every time had read it, and this resulted in a long-term gain. It might seem like he hadn't made a huge progress if one were to look after a short period of time. However, the accumulation over a long period of time would eventually turn into a very big profit. The fifth god's cultivation speed had been very quick, and this page of ancient god scripture had played a big role in that. You beasts are acting very recklessly. Xing Feiyue repelled an attack from the leader of those silver giant apes. I know your intelligence isn't inferior to that of humans. You should have surrendered to me earlier, and I would have spared all you mountain spirit beasts in return. However, you are following the path of your own doom now. So, I will kill all of you at once. Xing Feiyue had become somewhat impatient. He would have spared the lives of these silver giant apes if they had surrendered in the beginning, and he would have made them his slaves after that. However, he had already lost his patience by now. The dead body of this unknown colossus had attracted his desire beyond any known limits. So he couldn't wait any more. Arrogant human! The leader of the silver giant apes roared. An invisible force suddenly rushed out from the top of its head. It seemed as if a godly ape was standing between the heaven and the earth. It felt as if its domineering presence could scare the gods and devil into submission. Someone like you doesn't stand a chance. Xing Feiyue sneered. A dreadful, magical power suddenly pressed down from above. A palace suddenly appeared from the void. It issued waves of sage power as it fell down from the sky. It was a sage tool in reality. Xing Feiyue had condensed the palace where he lived into a sage tool. It possessed endless might and could be transported anywhere and any time via a portal. Rumble. The palace grew bigger and bigger as it swept towards that giant ape leader to crush it. The entire world broke down into pieces. Cracks appeared in the space as if it was a mirror. They then proliferated across the entire horizon like a spider web. The legs of that leader of the silver giant apes suddenly broke down, and it fell to its knees. Its martial power was far inferior to that of a heaven's pride expert like Xing Feiyue, who had been practicing since several hundred years. Moreover, Xing Feiyue's strength had increased very greatly since he had taken out a sage tool. Beasts will always be beasts. I had given you a chance to live, but you didn't take that. A sinister look appeared on Xing Feiyue's face. Endless divine beams emitted from the palm of his big hand. The divine beams got interweaved, formed a huge net of light, and advanced towards that leader of the silver giant apes to shroud and crush it. Bang! That leader of the silver giant apes was trapped by the large light net of Xing Feiyue's. It then exploded in the sky and transformed into a mass of blood fog. The other silver giant apes scattered in panic when they saw that their leader had been killed. However, how could they have escaped from the hands of Xing Feiyue? They were annihilated one by one. Xing Feiyue jumped onto the mountain after he had killed those silver giant apes. He faced upwards and burst into laughter. Ha ha, ha ha, ha ha, God is favoring me. This colossus obviously has an extraordinary origin. Even its dead body is an astronomical wealth. Ha 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 ha. Congratulations, senior brother Xing. You will become invincible throughout all the generations. The other princes and their subordinates clapped for Sheng Feiyue and praised him in flattery. They enjoyed a noble status in the Great Wei State. However, they knew that they were nothing in front of Sheng Feiyue. The Great Wei State undoubtedly possessed outstanding national strength. However, even dozens of such Great Wei States were nothing in front of the Meteor sect. These people could act domineeringly in the Great Wei State. However, they were nothing when it came to the bigger picture of the Meteor world. In fact, they were far inferior to Meteor sect's powerful core disciple like Sheng Feiyue. They could only fawn over him when in his presence. Rumble. Sheng Feiyue was still feeling pleased with himself when the energy of the entire world suddenly congealed together. Countless spirit energies suddenly came whistling towards the mountain range. Then, a powerful aura erupted from the mountain. Sheng Feiyue's complexion had darkened. Someone had beaten him to a punch. To be continued. Chapter 5:21. Sheng Feiyue saw this and became angry. He had realized that someone had taken advantage of the distraction his fight had created, and this person had then drilled their way inside. Damn it! This opportunistic son of a bit asterisk H has dared to take advantage of the distraction to go inside. Sheng Feiyue roared. He stretched his big hand, and it emitted endless rays of light. They then transformed into a big net of light and swept down. Bang! The entire mountain suddenly collapsed under the attack of this huge net. It seemed as if the sky had fallen down to the ground and had shattered into small pieces within a split second. Subsequently, the rubble from the mountain was reduced to powder. Then, waves of strong astral winds set off and dispersed these dusts. Bang! A golden real elemental energy appeared from below and soared into the sky. A violent turbulence surged up and around, and a slim figure appeared along with it. He was dressed in blue clothes. His eyes looked profound, and his aura felt formidable. In fact, it seemed as if an ancient devil god had reincarnated. The golden divinities were boiling on Yi Zaiwen's entire body. An exceptional fighting intention was overflowing from his body. Who are you? Sheng Feiyue's ice-cold eyes flickered indefinitely. He had roared these words out loudly. He had also felt that the energy of this man who stood before his eyes was boiling ferociously. Yi Shiwen grinned and replied, "Weren't you the one who was looking for me? Don't you wish to kill me? You are that so-called Dragon Master?" The second prince became bewildered when he looked into Yi Shiwen's eyes. He hadn't expected that the person they had been searching would appear in front of them in such a manner. Moreover, he was shocked to see that this man was much younger than he had expected. Martial arts experts could maintain their youthful appearance. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't a several hundred or thousand years old expert who had maintained his young appearance. Instead, he was very young. He looked 50 years old at most. How was it possible for such a young man to become a great master of alchemy? However, it must be true. Otherwise, Jiang Zhouqing would never have gone to meet him personally. Jiang Zhouqing had been practicing since several hundred years. Yet, even he couldn't surpass this Dragon Master. You are a liar. Isn't that right? You are a liar because you claim that you are a great master of alchemy. You wanted to sneak into our Great Wei Empire, right? What's your objective? The third prince exclaimed in anger when he saw Yi Zaiwen's real face for the first time. Humph! Where do you come from? You have dared to infiltrate the forces of our meteor sect. You have bad intentions. Wait and watch how I crack down on you and find out about your secrets. Sheng Feiyue sneered. His eyes didn't flicker anymore. His terrifying aura rushed out like an overwhelming vast ocean in order to suppress Yi Zaiwen's soul. I didn't know where to look for you. However, I didn't know that you yourself would appear in front of me. The time spent on trying to find you here, and there didn't go in vain after all. Sheng Feiyue was at Sage, small perfection realm. He was leaps and bounds ahead of the Sage Peak realm. Earlier, Yi Shiwen would have been no match for Sheng Feiyue, even if his fighting strength had been strong enough to rival that of the experts of the Sage Peak realm. Not to mention that Shang Feiyue was considered a very tyrannical expert even in the Sage, small perfection realm. It doesn't matter what your background is. You have dared to take advantage of me. You are courting death. Shang Feiyue shouted. His murderous aura surged up. He was a bit wary of Yi Shiwen at first. However, he didn't let that bother him for long. He belonged to a prestigious family, and he was a heaven's pride expert of his generation. Also, he had been unceasingly obtaining resources from the meteor sect. So, he wasn't worried about a random cultivator with no background, even if the said expert also had good qualifications. The contest between a random cultivator with no background and an expert of a legitimate sect would be one-sided even if they were to be in the same realm. Their access to resources, spirit stones, divine tools, power techniques, and so on just weren't on same level. Shang Feiyue extended his big hand. Endless rays of light suddenly burst from it and swept out towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. But Yi Shiwen wasn't going to be outdone. Golden divine beams had covered his entire body. In fact, it seemed as if Shang Feiyue was fighting against a golden statue. Bang! The fight had reached a superheated stage in no time, and both sides had started resorting to extreme methods. The entire space had shattered into pieces under their attacks. Their battle had reached to the sky. Those experts of the Great Wei Empire turned pale with fright. They were visibly surprised by Yi Ziwen's strength. All of them were familiar with Shang Feiyue's strength. He had merely been practicing for 300 years, but he had already entered the Sage, small perfection realm. He was a heaven's pride expert of his generation, and there was almost no doubt that he would advance to Great Sage realm in the future. He possessed incredible strength. That leader beast of Sage, small perfection realm, had also been slaughtered by him a moment ago. So, they had seen the extent of Shang Feiyue's strength. The ape leader was also in Sage, small perfection realm. Still, there had been a difference of cloud and mud between their strengths. Shang Feiyue's strength was so tyrannical that it was difficult to find a match for him among his peers. Perhaps only those top heavens pride experts could overshadow him. They had thought that Yi Shiwen would only have the strength of the Sage Peak realm at most. However, it didn't seem like he was in a disadvantageous position while fighting with Shang Feiyue, and this had left them in extreme shock. I didn't expect you to have some means of your own. However, that's also useless. After all, what are you in comparison to our meteor sect? Shang Feiyue hadn't obtained the upper hand over Yi Shiwen yet, and this had surprised him. He would have understood if Yi Shiwen had been in the Sage, small perfection realm. However, he didn't seem to be. In fact, he appeared to be in the intermediate stage of Sage realm. But Yi Shiwen had still managed to match him until now, and this had surpassed Shang Feiyue's imagination by far. Yi Shiwen slightly raised the corner of his mouth. His fighting strength had made a huge progress after he had made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage realm. He couldn't have dealt with Shang Feiyue so easily if he had still been in the initial stage of Sage realm. In fact, he would have been in a very difficult situation. He would have had to retreat instead. After all, his realm differed by a lot from that of Shang Feiyue's. Shang Feiyue had started operating the green rainbow meteor cultivation method inside his body. This was a very tyrannical power technique of the meteor sect. This technique had emerged out of the meteor sect's name. A starry white light was emanating from his entire body. He was attacking with his entire strength and wasn't holding back. It'll send you on your way to hell. Shang Feiyue flashed an evil grin. He brandished his palm. This was the meteor sect's technique. Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm. Only a few people in the meteor sect knew this palm technique. In fact, most of the core disciples hadn't even gotten the opportunity to learn this technique. However, Shang Feiyue had gotten this opportunity because he was a core disciple and a Heaven's Pride expert. This was enough to determine how praiseworthy this palm technique was. That palm slapped through the clouds that hung from the sky and broke down the entire blue dome of heaven. The killing intention was clearly overflowing to the heavens. However, he was surprised to see Yi Shiwen smiling in the face of this attack. Yi Shiwen suddenly raised the corner of his mouth and brandished his palm. However, it wasn't the fire clouds falling sky hand this time. Rather, it was the Thousand Stars tyrant palm. Moreover, Yi Zaiwen's hands had somehow displayed it in its truest form. It wasn't entirely in its purest form, so to say. However, it looked more tyrannical than the attack that had been launched by Shang Feiyue. This was because of the star power in Yi Zaiwen's body. Bang! The two big hands suddenly collided in the sky. Countless shadows of those two palms filled the entire sky, and it seemed as if these palm shadows were ripping the vast sky apart. The world shook and collapsed under their attacks. The murderous energy flew from the sky and surged all over. The scene appeared similar to the Judgment Day. It seemed as if cold water had been poured onto those princes and other people of the Great Wei Empire. Chills ran down their spines. They looked insignificant in front of this level of fighting power. They could only acquire the position of the Emperor of Great Wei Empire. However, they were undoubtedly insignificant in front of these genuine young elites. Only a colossal force like the Meteor Sect could have nurtured such young elites. Indeed, there were other people that had such exceptional innate talent. However, other people used to get a pitiful amount of resources when compared to the disciples of these big sections. A good amount of resources was the so-called basic requirement for effective cultivation. In fact, it was considered a joke if someone wanted to make the breakthroughs without having the unceasing support of these resources. How is it possible? A look of fright flashed on Shang Feiyue's face. He wasn't shocked because Yi Shiwen was able to contend against him. Instead, it was because Yi Shiwen had used the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique. After all, this was the Meteor Sect's secret technique. Are you also a disciple of the Meteor Sect? It's impossible. Could Yi Shiwen also be a disciple of the Meteor Sect? He had never seen Yi Shiwen. But then, again, the Meteor Sect had several million disciples. How could he recognize all of them? However, another thought crossed his mind. It would have been normal if he hadn't heard about an ordinary person. But Yi Shiwen wasn't ordinary. He had a very high cultivation level at a very young age. So, how come he had never heard of him? He didn't believe that Yi Shiwen could be a hidden cultivator or whatnot. A chicken is a chicken and a phoenix is a phoenix. A chicken can't be compared with a phoenix, even if a phoenix has met with a misfortune. Only the cultivation of a person is the factor that can decide whether they are a chicken or a phoenix. A phoenix will always be a phoenix. A phoenix will stand out even if they have sunk into a group of chickens. Their shine won't get concealed. Could he be some elder's foreign disciple? This wasn't impossible. After all, the Meteor Sect had so many elders, and many of them were eccentric. They would teach top secret techniques to outsiders because they considered it to be their predestined affinity. The so-called immortal fate is beyond everything. And Yi Zaiwen's Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique also seemed somewhat unfamiliar. Therefore, this ought to be the case. Of course, Shang Feiyue would never get to know the real reason why Yi Zaiwen's Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique looked strange. It wasn't because he hadn't learned it properly, and it wasn't because he had misinterpreted some vital concept while learning it from a copy of a secret martial arts book that was left behind by some master. Instead, it was because Yi Shiwen had used the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique for the first time in his life. He had certainly used the mysterious space in that split second to deduce the mysteries of the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique. However, it would obviously look a bit strange since he had used it for the first time. So this out of his hands. Meteor Sect? I am not. Yi Shiwen grinned. His snow-white teeth somewhat horrified the people. It's over. Yi Shiwen spoke up. The killing intention flashed in his eyes. Yi Shiwen had never shown any leniency in killing his enemies. A tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye was his motto. If someone wanted to fight with him, he would certainly do that. And if someone wanted to kill him, he would certainly kill that person. It was that simple. The news of this mustn't spread outside. It would cause a huge uproar, whether it was about the involvement of Great Way Empire or about the corpse of the Star Colossus. The Great Way Empire wasn't a very big empire for the Meteor Sect. However, this matter concerned Meteor Sect, and they wouldn't allow other people to interfere. In fact, they would become extremely enraged if they found out about the things that were going on here. And he reckoned that he would be chased by a group of great sage experts if the news of the corpse of the Star Colossus got out. Yi Shiwen knew that he must not leave any clue. To be continued.